Committee for UK science and its role in government to be drawn from the crisis. Manifestly, most of the analysis and conclusions will have to be and appropriately done after the crisis has subsided. But it is important to take evidence during the crisis from time to time, really for two in particular reasons. One is to be able to capture contemporary evidence of what is in people's minds during the crisis, to be able to review afterwards and not just to rely on the benefit of hindsight. And secondly, if there are lessons to be learned already from what has happened and that can be applied in real time, it's obviously very important that we should discover them and be able to reflect on them if that is the case. So that is the reason for today's session. Our first witness is Professor Neil Fergusson. Welcome, Professor Fergusson.
Good morning.
Thank you in particular for appearing, given that you have suffered from the virus. I hope you're feeling better.
Yes, improving day by day.
That's good. You had earlier we caught sight of your mug. Keep calm and carry on. And I think you personify that particular approach. Can I ask, was the experience as you expected?
I don't think I knew what to expect. It was like rather bad flu. There were a couple of days where it was really quite unpleasant, but I think I'm basically on the mend now. Actually, severe symptoms tend to happen in the second week, so I'm crossing my fingers, but I think it's basically over for me.
Good. Well, we hope it is. I hope the second week won't be as bad as the first. Can I start by asking you, Professor Fergusson, are you a member of SAGE, the Scientific Advisory Group in Emergencies?
Yes, I am.
And who are the other members? Could you just give us a kind of feel for what that group comprises?
So SAGE consists of other chief scientific advisors from government departments, and then a set of external members, including they're the head of subgroups of SAGE. So there's a subgroup on modelling, and chaired by Graham Medley from London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. There's a subgroup of behaviour. Then there are specific individuals representing expertise in virology, immunology, behavioural science, and the like. I won't list all. I don't actually think I could remember all the members off the top of my head, but I would say there are probably 10 to 12 external members, and then a lot of people who attend meetings as observers.
I see. And all of the chief scientific advisors from every government department?
Yes, the meeting is co-chaired by Chief Medical Officer and the Government Chief Scientific Advisor, Patrick Valance, but there is representation from every department and from Cabinet Office number 10.
Thank you. And how often does it meet as a full group?
It has been meeting twice a week since, I can't remember the precise date, sometime in January.
Thank you. And has SAGE presented unified advice to government? Has it formed a consensus? Or has it offered different opinions?
It will vary depending on the topic under consideration. So the aim of SAGE is to give the co-chairs the best scientific evidence and the uncertainty around specific topics. So we're not trying to reduce uncertainty, we're trying to convey to Patrick and Chris what is known about the science, what the uncertainties are, so that they can make a judgment about how they communicate that to ministers.
I see. And in your view, having seen the decisions that have been taken by ministers and having been on SAGE, would you consider that the government has followed the advice of SAGE?
So to be clear, SAGE does not recommend policy. SAGE makes judgments about science and good scientific evidence, including about how rapidly the epidemic is moving, what the likely lethality is, and not recommendations about interventions, but insights into what interventions might have what effect. So it is not I'm not sure if the relevant question asking here has the government followed the advice of SAGE. The government, I believe, has been informed by the scientific evidence and has balanced that against other considerations such as economic, health, and all the things you might expect it to.
Thank you. Are there any areas where there has not been a united view amongst the scientists on SAGE, and where it's been necessary to report a significant difference of opinion?
I think on key conclusions, no, but on lots of the details, yes. People have not so much taken different views, have emphasised different aspects of the science or the uncertainty in particular topics.
Could you give perhaps a representative example of that type of detail?
So, for instance, I mean, in the media today, you'll see reports of paper, claiming that a large proportion of people may have no risk of severe disease, or there may be an asymptomatic pool which you're underestimating. So, SAGE has considered that issue in a lot of detail. We have ruled out the sort of scenarios actually in that paper, but there is still uncertainty about the extent of asymptomatic infection. I would class that as not a critical issue because it doesn't really make any difference to what government response should be at the current time. Conversely, I would say in the last 2-3 weeks, the increasing evidence about both the growth rate of the epidemic, the severity and the likely healthcare demand has led to a fair degree of unanimity on SAGE about the impacts of the epidemic.
Thank you, that's very helpful. We'll come back to the particular study that you mentioned. Just referring to your paper and your colleagues' paper at Imperial of the 16th of March, when you concluded that mitigation is unlikely to be feasible. You said that in the UK this conclusion has only been reached in the last few days with the refinement of the likely ICU, intensive care unit demand due to COVID-19. Could you explain why that modelling of the intensive care capacity was not available until that point in March?
So maybe I'll go back. So we, the London School, London John Edmonds Group, and NHS England, senior analysts got together on Sunday the 1st of March to review with clinicians and scientists the evidence around the severity of COVID-19. We had at that point come up with probably what is still the most definitive estimate of case fatality. That meeting was really to put that into a UK context and try and make an assessment of likely bed demand. We did that, and actually that day and the immediate days following that came up with estimates for NHS England and SAGE of the likely, therefore, profile of the epidemic in terms of bed demand and mortality. NHS England then looked at the potential for surge capacity of the following week or two, and that's quite an intensive exercise. I was not involved in it, so you'll have to ask them. The one thing which came into play then, probably about 10, I can't remember the precise time, about 10 days after that, was it became clear from data from Italy and actually the UK experience that prior assumptions about intensive care usage we'd made on the 1st of March were probably optimistic, and intensive care demand might be twice that we had anticipated. And the reason for that is that we had assumed that of roughly half the patients requiring ventilation with severe COVID-19 would be able to be ventilated emerging data shows that that's issue gives rather poor clinical outcomes.
We're struggling a bit with the feed, Professor Fergusson, but we can still see you. So just repeat that last bit again, if you wouldn't mind.
Apologies.
No,
so
not your fault.
the revision was that basically estimates of the proportion of patients requiring invasive ventilation, mechanical ventilation, which can only be done on a critical care unit, roughly doubled. And so the combination of that and NHS England assessing how much they could surge led us to conclude that there would be no way that, even with what we're now talking about, surging at least double normal capacity, if not triple, would be still insufficient to cope with an epidemic which was just mitigated, where we weren't going for full-scale lockdown and containment.
Thank you. I understand that, and indeed the peak, according to your paper, is that the peak would be 30 times the maximum capacity of the ICUs across the country. I think I'm right in saying.
So that would be an unmitigated. I think I don't have the paper in front of me. I think we concluded it was about 8 times in the sort of mitigated single peak epidemic, the best we could do. I should say that with what NHS are now planning to put in place, that gap reduces from 8-fold to I think about 3-fold, but it's still a 3-fold gap.
So on the basis of the announcements that the Prime Minister made this week, you think that gap at the peak is about 3-fold?
No. I mean, so let me go back and be clear. So NHS, since we did that initial analysis, which came out on the 16th of March, NHS have refined their ICU surge capacity estimates. Those have gone up again, more than doubled. And that means the gap, had we followed the mitigation strategy, would have been less, but it would have still overwhelmed ICUs.
I understand. And have you...
In this current strategy being adopted now, we think that in some areas of the country, ICUs will get very close to capacity, but that it won't be breached at a national level.
So that's a very important point. So and that is a combination of the surge in the NHS provision, plus the measures that the government announced this week, that will at a national level, on your modelling, be containable within the capacity of the health system.
Yes, there will be some areas of the country which are extremely stressed, but we are reasonably confident, which is all we can be at the current time, that at a national level we'll be within capacity.
Thank you. That will be tremendously reassuring to many people, although we do understand your caveats that this is based on predicting something that hasn't happened yet. Just a couple more points, then I'll turn to some of my colleagues. There is a perception that the approach that's been taken in the UK and has been reflected in the papers that have been helpfully published by SAGE is rather different from the approach that's been taken in other countries in the world, notably in Asia, but sometimes in the continent of Europe as well. And indeed, in the paper that was published in the bundle of evidence dated the 9th of March, the potential impact of behaviour and social interventions on the epidemic of COVID-19 in the United Kingdom, the summary view there was, and I quote, implementing a subset of these measures, these interventions, would be ideal, i.e. not the whole set. Whilst this would have a moderate impact, it would be much less likely to have a second wave. In comparison, combining stringent measures as a long-term policy may have a similar impact to that seen in Hong Kong or Singapore, but could result in a large second epidemic wave once the measures were lifted. Can you just talk us through why you think amongst eminent scientists in this country and around the world, quite a different view was taken on what was the way to manage this? And you obviously in SAGE concerned about this second peak.
Yes, so the background to that is that we were being asked to look at interventions which would, the optimal goal was to not have this country locked down for a year or more, and to balance mitigating the health impact of the epidemic against the economic impact and the impact on the NHS. And so, had it been possible to deploy extreme cocooning of the elderly, shield them from severe disease, and manage the epidemic such that it didn't exceed healthcare capacity, then there would be clear advantages economically to having it over by the end of the summer. That's the context where we were looking at a range of interventions which might achieve that. When it became apparent that actually there would be no way of managing epidemic to the extent that healthcare demand in that first wave would not overwhelm the NHS, then we moved to, actually in some ways slightly reluctantly, looking at much more intensive strategies. I say a little reluctantly because, as I commented before, we've been paying for this year for many decades to come in terms of the economic impact.
Yes, I see. Thank you for that. And is it your view that the majority of the population will expect to contract COVID-19, or do you think that can be avoided?
So with the current strategy, no, we don't think that would be the case. The aim of this strategy is to suppress transmission really, frankly, indefinitely until we have some other countermeasures to put in place, particularly vaccine. The challenge with it is, if in some sense we allow a significant fraction of the population to become infected, we're back into the scenario of an epidemic which the health system cannot cope with.
I see. And so the difference between, as it were, the UK view, or the SAGE view, and other countries is about the capacity of the local healthcare systems to manage to absorb the pressures during the peak.
I think the strategies are fairly aligned at this point. I think the UK, more than, not all countries, but many countries, did intensive assessment of whether alternative strategies were possible in terms of avoiding the country needing to be in lockdown or equally effective measures for a very long period. We concluded obviously that that wasn't possible, and therefore actually the strategy we're in now is rather similar to many but not all other countries.
Thank you. And a final one from me before I hand over to colleagues. What was notable in the bundle of evidence that was published is that a lot of the work of the advisory group, insofar as the evidence published reflects that, is around these social interventions, distancing, closure of schools, etc. Comparatively little to testing and contact tracing, which has been foundational to some of the other approaches, as you're aware. In fact, the evidence includes a couple of quite striking papers that point to the importance of that as background papers, but they don't appear in the report of the deliberations. Is what's been published a fair reflection of what has been discussed, or did this have a more prominent place in the discussions?
Testing has always been discussed significantly. The reason it wasn't included in initial modelling was the projections by PHE of how quickly this country could ramp up testing capacity. We're looking at, so if we have to transit from this suppression strategy and the lockdown strategy into something this country can maintain long term, undoubtedly testing, much more widespread testing, contact tracing and other methods will have to be deployed. If we're talking about back in January, February, early March, it's very clear from messages from Public Health England that we would have nowhere near enough testing capacity to adopt that strategy.
And that informed the discussions that took place in SAGE? Thank you.
Yes.
When do you expect the peak of the epidemic to be? Have you made a projection of that in your model?
Yes, it's something we're working on intensively this week. If, and it's an if, we're moderately confident, as I said, but can't be completely sure. If the current measures work as we would expect them to, then we will see intensive care unit demand peak in approximately 2.5 to 3 weeks' time, and then decline thereafter. The reason for that lag is because it takes people something like 2 to 3 weeks from being infected to actually being in an intensive care unit. And so the measures put in place last week, intensified this week, we think will have had a significant effect on transmission, but it takes that time for it to propagate through to healthcare demand.
I see. And how many people, either as numbers or percentage of the population, do you expect to be affected by COVID-19, say during the next 6 months or whatever interval is the most appropriate to consider?
It's a very difficult thing to assess precisely at the moment based on current data. It will vary a lot by geographic area. It's possible that up to 5 at the outside 10% of the London population will have some form of infection in that time, but then basically once we achieve suppression, case numbers go down to a low level, that number is unlikely to increase much beyond that.
I see. And obviously a very serious point is the number of fatalities. Have you made a projection of that? It was obviously one of the concerns that you had in the development of the strategy.
Yes, so not a detailed projection based on the most current data, but we assessed in that report on the 16th of March that fatalities would be probably unlikely to exceed about 20,000 with effectively a lockdown of intense social distancing strategy. But it could be substantially lower than that, and really we need to, that's where real-time analysis and modelling of the type we're doing now will be needed to refine those precise estimates.
Thank you, I'm very grateful. Aaron Bell, I think, has got some questions on some of the recent publications of studies on epidemiology.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Professor Fergusson. Just to go on public health interventions more generally, could you, well, you concluded that epidemic suppression was the only viable strategy at the current time. Do you think that is a feasible strategy for the UK, and if so, for how long?
So, we clearly cannot lock down the country for a year. The challenge that many countries in the world are dealing with is kind of how we move from an initial intense lockdown, which is what China deployed, I should say, and now lifting. How do we move from that to something which will have probably societal effects but will allow the economy to restart? As the Chair pointed out, I mean, that is likely to rely on very large-scale testing and contact tracing. It should be stated that the entire world is in an early stage, though, in terms of developing such strategies. China is now it's only been coming out of lockdown really in the most affected areas in the last week. We have yet to see quite what the results will be, the extent to which transmission will resurge. I suppose the most encouraging data is perhaps coming out of South Korea. It should be, people talk about South Korea as if they only did lots of testing. They actually had quite a lot of social distancing on top of that and school closure. So even for South Korea, it remains to be seen quite what will happen when they completely restart the economy. But they have relied on very rapid, intensive testing and case isolation, perhaps more than most other countries, with some degree of success. And so we're looking at that as a model. The UK does not have the testing capability to replicate South Korea right now, but it is likely in the next few weeks we will do.
Thank you. So, bearing all that in mind, to what extent would you say reaching a degree of herd immunity, either through a vaccine or through, in the end, everybody having had this, is that the only complete exit strategy for having COVID-19, or is what you just described in South Korea and the report, the paper that Imperial published yesterday on China, are those actual exit strategies, or are they just management strategies?
I think there's a management strategy. So I mean, the very intensive testing, contact tracing, isolation is still going to have very significant costs, both economic and societal, associated with it. And it's yet, I have to say, we don't know how sustainable it is long term. So the long-term exit from this is clearly the hopes around a vaccine.
Thank you. If I could just ask you about a couple of other papers. You mentioned earlier the one that was reported yesterday from University of Oxford, Gupta et al., suggesting that potentially half the population may have already had it. Could I ask you a few general comments on that and whether it can be squared with some of the observed data, for example, the Diamond Princess case?
Yeah, we don't think it's consistent with the observed data. I'm not sure if the Diamond Princess is a good example because that was a very close community, but certainly even if you take that, then the proportion of symptomatic cases was much higher than assumed by Gupta et al. We also have been analysing data from a number of Italian villages at the Epidemic Centre in the last few weeks, where they did a viral swab, absolutely everybody in the village at different stages of the outbreak. And we can compare that with sort of official case numbers, people report symptomatic cases. And again, those data all point to the fact that we're nowhere near the Gupta scenario in terms of the extent of infection.
Okay, and secondly, in the Times yesterday, there's a paper reported, it's before peer review, from Professor Thomas of Bristol University, who questions the damage to the economy and whether that's being taken into account, suggesting, I think on his paper, that a fall of more than 6.5% of GDP would in the long run be worse for health outcomes because of the obvious correlations between GDP and life expectancy. Is that any part of your models, or are you just focusing on essentially flattening the curve in the shorter term?
So, I mean, I think that's actually a very important consideration. It sounds very utilitarian in a philosophical sense, but when you're kind of weighing up potentially, if we had gone a mitigation scenario, maybe 200,000 deaths versus economic impact, given the scale of economic cost and exactly those unintended consequences for health in other sectors, I think it's a totally valid consideration. And one the government and scientists have been grappling with. We don't know what the level of excess deaths will be from this epidemic. And by excess deaths, I mean by the end of the year, what proportion of those people who died from COVID-19 would have died anyhow? But it might be as much as half to two-thirds of the deaths we're seeing from COVID-19, because this is affecting people typically with either at the end of their lives or with poor health conditions. So, I mean, I think these considerations are very valid. Nevertheless, policy was determined in some sense less by that, which is a valid scientific and ethical debate, but more by the evidence that really the NHS could not cope at all with the level of demand which was going to proceed. And that would have unintended consequences on health of the entire nation in terms of people who are being treated for other conditions.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Zara.
Thank you, Dr. Fergusson. You've spoken about more intensive and socially disruptive interventions being required to suppress transition to low levels, and that it's likely social distancing will be needed in place for many months, perhaps until a vaccine is available. With the measures the government's already taken, how likely are we to see another peak in the winter, and could this, if at all, be stopped?
So, we think the government's measures now will, with a reasonable but not certain degree of confidence, will turn the curve over, will turn the epidemic from a growing epidemic into a declining epidemic. Whether we get resurgence of transmission depends really on the policy decisions made probably in 3 or 4 weeks' time, and the effectiveness of the measures we put in place to replace the current regime. This comes back to the issue of can we move from a complete lockdown, which almost certainly isn't sustainable for the rest of the year, to something perhaps making better, more use of intensive testing, contact tracing. I mean, I can't give you an answer to your question though. I mean, is there there will be some resurgence of transmission. The hope is that by deploying more focused policies to suppress those local outbreaks, we can maintain infection levels at low levels in the country as a whole indefinitely. It remains to be seen how we actually achieve this and how practical it proves to be.
And just to follow up, I want to quickly ask about modelling for different age groups. There's been a lot of focus on the elderly, and rightly so, and we've got a policy of shielding for the next 12 weeks. At UHCW in Coventry, we've had the youngest victim, an 18-year-old person with underlying health conditions. So what do your models suggest about the impact on younger people, particularly in light of how much time young doctors, nurses and hospital staff are spending around infected patients and the availability of PPE for them?
Well, that's a good point. I mean, I did have another to add to the chair, but without doubt, most mortality is going to be in the elderly and frail. But mortality from this virus in younger age groups is not insignificant. It's substantially higher than, for instance, seasonal influenza. So whilst the absolute proportion of deaths will be low, we will unfortunately see more of such instances of mortality in younger age groups. And that has clearly informed decision making as well.
Thank you.
Mark Logan.
Thank you, Professor Fergusson. And just going back to a point that was raised there in terms of, at the moment, seemingly in the southern hemisphere, which is kind of the opposite side to us in terms of winter to summer, already have cases. And to what extent in your modelling and your thinking come this summer, do you see higher temperatures having a positive effect on managing the decline of the virus?
Yes, there's been a lot of debate around that. There's very little in the way of firm evidence. I think it is plausible that this virus will show similar patterns to other respiratory viruses, and that suggests that transmissibility of the virus will be somewhat reduced in summer, but perhaps not by more than 10 or 20%. So that will aid control, but it's not as if this virus could not transmit in the summer. Our best guess is you could easily get a very large epidemic in the summer, although it would spread slightly more slowly than it would in the winter months. There's evidence from other viruses, such as influenza, about this. Back in 2009, when we had a very mild H1N1 pandemic, we were seeing very effective and efficient transmission of that virus all the way through to July.
Okay, yep, thank you. And then in terms of regionality, so within the UK, your current study looks at kind of Great Britain on its own and excluding Northern Ireland. So I wonder, can your model extend to the whole of the UK? And then secondly is around some of the research that I've read on this and looking at maps seems to suggest that, yes, in Westminster, where we're located in London, that we have a current higher rate, but in the rest of the UK, there does appear to be hubs of infection, which may be slightly different in other countries, and I wonder, could you comment on that?
So what we're seeing now is really community transmission across the UK, and indeed across the island of Ireland. The reason we're seeing hotspots is, we think, down to different levels of seeding of infection into the country in different areas, really in terms of cases which have come in from outside the country. That's how the infection got into the country. And so clearly we always would expect London to be ahead of the rest of the country. That's the principal destination of most foreign visitors into the country, people returning. And so what we're seeing is a result of that difference in seeding and a bit of random chance. For instance, there's a hotspot around Nottingham and Derby at the moment. We might not have predicted that based on people returning from overseas. It's probably likely, just as in Lombardy and northern Italy, that one or two people came back somewhat earlier, maybe in late January, and started seeding transmission there. It was unrecognised, and therefore that bit of the country is a little bit ahead of other bits which got less seeding. But there is transmission everywhere. I mean, I talked to my parents the weekend in mid Wales, remotest rural mid Wales, I should say, and they've seen a case in their local community hospital. So it is very widely distributed.
Thank you.
And coming to that, of course, about modelling of the whole country, yes, we're intending to roll out models across the whole of Europe and allow policymakers to both to use our model in different settings, and indeed we'll be releasing the model as open source code in the next week or so.
On that point, Professor Ferguson, you said in an earlier answer to the committee that the capacity of the national health system would be adequate, but perhaps not in particular places. Is that a bottom-up analysis or a top-down prediction? In other words, do you know already that particular places will need to be helped out by others?
Yes, I mean, we're producing daily estimates, short-term forecasts of healthcare demand at the NHS trust level, and then aggregating those up to English regions, for instance. And so we do know, and you can see it in the data, you've heard the reports, that there are individual hotspots where ICUs in particular hospitals are already being overwhelmed. So, I mean, it's informed by that sort of analysis.
That's it, thank you. Catherine Fletcher.
Professor Fergusson, I think the British public are extremely grateful to the work of the scientific advisors, exemplified by yourself, spending time whilst you're still not feeling brilliant answering these questions. So I just want to say a big thank you for taking the time to come in and do a cracking job as well. I'm sure I speak for lots of people across the country when I say that. In terms of the modelling, people are desperate to understand to make sure they can do the right thing. And I've certainly had a lot of questions from South Ribble residents about different rates of transmission. 5 people working in a mechanic garage who are very familiar with each other versus 50 strangers in a pub. And I think it would be really helpful if you could explain how you're modelling those different types of social interactions.
So first of all, I should just be clear that very few models, but certainly the models we look at do not model society at that level of granularity to distinguish 5 people in a garage versus a group in a pub. What we do is try to abstract out those things. So we model, for instance, workplaces. And in workplaces, we represent people who meet every day, or most days, for instance, small networks of people who have persistent contacts. And we compare that with typical social mixing in outside households, outside schools, outside workplaces, which is much more random between people. So we capture some of those essential details without capturing absolutely every detail, which would be impractical. I'm not sure if that helps.
Okay.
I can expand.
And just very briefly, and then the difference between the big groups. So there's lots of people wanting to understand how risky it is to go to Old Trafford versus watch football on the sofa with your granddad.
Yeah, and I completely agree with how kind of the Chief Scientific Advisor and Chief Medical Officer explained this. I mean, all the evidence we have is that the thing which poses the most risk of transmission is being in close proximity with people for extended periods of time. So whether you do that sitting next to somebody you don't know at a football match, or whether you do it sitting next to somebody in a pub, makes very little difference. There's nothing intrinsically more risky about a mass gathering compared with normal social activity.
Thank you.
I have a question from one of our colleagues who can't be here today, Graham Stringer MP, who asks, Professor Fergusson, what is the sensitivity of your model to variations in the incubation period, the basic reproduction number, and the onset and length of time of infectiousness?
So, I mean, there are 2 very important quantities. One is the reproduction number of secondary cases per case, and the other is what's called the various serial interval distribution, or generation time distribution. Basically, how long it takes from when I get infected to when I've infected all the people I might infect. And those quantities govern a lot of things about how difficult the epidemic is to control, but also how fast it grows in time. I should admit that, I mean, we've always done sensitivity analysis in the modelling to a variety of levels of value to those quantities. What we've been seeing, though, in Europe in the last week or 2 is a rate of growth of the epidemic which was faster than we expected from early data in China. And so we are revising upwards our central best estimate of the reproduction number to something more, a little bit above, of the order of 3 or a little bit above, rather than about the 2.5 level. We don't, I mean, that actually adds more evidence to support the more intensive social distancing measures applied this week, because the higher the reproduction number is, the more intensive controls need to be to achieve suppression of the epidemic. But the current values are still within the wide range of values which modelling groups informing SAGE have been looking at previously.
Thank you. And given that SAGE has recommended an escalation of the response in order to keep NHS capacity, to keep the cases within NHS capacity, are those numbers, those parameters now stable, or would you expect to have to revise them again? And if so, is the reassuring reflection you were able to give to the committee about the capacity of the health system, is that contingent on there being no further change to any of those variables?
So we're getting a better, maybe I'll put it this way, we're getting a better picture all the time from surveillance data, which I have to say is imperfect, but as it accumulates, we understand the patterns of transmission, not just in China, which we were relying on before, but in this country and other European countries better. So I think future changes will be, undoubtedly parameter estimates will be refined, but the changes will be less than we've seen in the past. Ourselves and a number of other groups are constantly updating models and predictions of both immediate bed demand in the next few weeks and the likely impact of interventions, but I don't think they'll change to the extent that they undermine the conclusions I've given you today.
Professor Fergusson, we're very grateful for you appearing before the committee today. You've been extremely helpful and informative, and as Catherine said, to have done that when you've recovered from the nasty experience of having gone through the virus is a real testament to your professionalism and your resilience, and we're very grateful. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll just take a break while we organise the next witnesses.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
Dr. Horton, thank you very much indeed for joining the committee this morning. You may have heard me say at the beginning of the previous session that the committee will want to look at the lessons to be learned from this epidemic for policymakers in the UK, but it's important to gather evidence during the crisis and also to inform future decisions that may need to be taken in the light of the evidence during the crisis. Perhaps I can start by asking, you've been a notable critic in some ways of the response that has been taken. Is it your assessment that the government has taken reliably scientific advice and acted upon it, or are you concerned that in some way it may not have done?
Well, maybe I can answer that question by taking us back to the last week of January, when the true extent of what was taking place in Wuhan was beginning to be understood. We published 3 papers in the final week of January, which set out the severity of COVID-19.
These are papers in the Lancet, I should clarify for people who may not know, of which you're the editor-in-chief.
Yeah, indeed. And those papers were truly alarming. Those papers showed that this disease caused a serious fatal pneumonia. A third of patients who were being talked in those papers were requiring admission to the intensive care unit. The number of deaths that was being described was rising quickly. The authors of those papers were advocating the immediate provision of personal protective equipment, urging the importance of testing and isolation, describing the fact that there was no effective treatment, and also emphasising the pandemic potential. Now, this was a signal from the front lines of the epidemic at the end of January, and I think that all of us, many of us at the Lancet, that was a red flag. And we had, it's been 7 to 8 weeks since that time, and February was the opportunity for the UK to really prepare based upon testing, isolation, quarantine, physical distancing, ICU capacity, and so on. And I think you described being critical, and yes, in the sense that we missed that opportunity. We could have used the month of February based upon what we knew in January. And when I looked at the evidence that Sage posted on the website, there's a lot of evidence. And it's great that they've been so transparent. But what strikes me is the mismatch between the urgent warning that was coming from the front line in China in January and the honestly somewhat pedestrian evaluation of the likely severity of the outbreak in that evidence. That suggests to me that we didn't understand fully what was taking place on the front line. And what I also didn't understand is why those 3 papers weren't part of the evidence. I mean, those papers were fully available, openly accessible, published on January the 24th, January the 29th, and January the 31st. And why they weren't part of the published papers that Sage considered somewhat mystical.
So, Dr. Horton, just reflecting on the structure of the advice that is given from science on this, we heard from Professor Fergusson that there's quite a broad spread of genuine experts of great standing in this, many of whom will be known to you as editor-in-chief of the Lancet. So how do you explain what you've just said is the absence of reflections on papers that you consider to be very important?
Well, I think first, when I look at the evidence that Sage considered, it's from extremely respected groups, largely within the United Kingdom. But what I haven't seen is an outreach to the scientists in China. The big difference in China now compared with 2003 when there was the SARS outbreak is that China has world-class scientists who are doing absolutely cutting-edge work. And they responded in the most unbelievably rapid way to gather evidence, transmit it to the world, to send this warning signal. So if I had been chair of Sage, I would have wanted to be going to those scientists on the front line and saying, please come and tell us your experience. What is coming for us in the UK? Why are you sending this warning signal? Because it's not there in Sage evidence. That's the first thing. And then the second, if I can just add the second part, which is I don't see the clinician, I don't see the clinical input and the public health input. I see the modelling input. There's evidence on modelling, there's evidence on behavioural science, on mass gatherings, but I don't see the evidence from the public health community or from the clinical community. And I think especially if the clinical community has been giving evidence, they would have said, if the burden of intensive care unit usage, presentation of patients with severe viral pneumonia that respiratory ARDS, this is something that we need to be taking exceptionally seriously now, January.
I'll come on to the composition of SAGE to follow up the point that you made. But there are people of great eminence and international distinction that are members of SAGE, and my experience, I'm sure, as yours, is that science is resolutely international, and much collaboration in research crosses borders and crosses continents. So how do you explain, how do you account for the relative scarceness of references to research that has been done in Asia at this time? Do you have a hypothesis as to why this may be the case?
I really don't, because the people who are leading the effort in China, Chen Wang, president of the Chinese Academy of Medical Sciences, Chen Zhu, who's the former Minister of Health, Ma Xiaowei, who's current Minister of Health, George Lung, who is Professor in Hong Kong, who was one of the first to model the outbreak and send a warning signal in his January 31st paper about the risk of a global pandemic. These people are all very, very well known to the scientific community and will be very well known, I'm sure, to the Chief Scientific Advisor and to the Chief Medical Officer. An email to George Lung or Chen Wang or Chen Zhu to say, we'd like to bring you into our discussions to understand what's taking place in China would have been easy. And it doesn't look from the evidence that I've seen that took place. And that seems to me a matter of regret.
And just on to the point that you made or implied about the structure of SAGE, you said you were surprised that there were not clinicians there, or there wasn't that representation. Are there amendments to the composition of this advisory group that you would therefore recommend?
Well, we don't know who is a member of the advisory group, do we? So it's a little difficult to be sure what to recommend. But for a condition where you have acute viral pneumonia that rapidly leads to a critical care situation, I hope we have some of our best respiratory and critical care leaders on that committee. Given the public health dimensions, I hope we have some of our best public health scientists, not just modelers. As important as mathematical models are, it's very important to have that public health dimension. You brought it up in your questioning to Professor Fergusson around testing and isolation and quarantine. These are basic public health interventions, and I think one of the surprises expressed by the public health community is that dimension of the response hasn't been more forthrightly presented by SAGE, and that might reflect the fact that there isn't a strong public health presence on SAGE. But again, I'm saying that in slight absence of knowing who is on the committee. There is
a paper in the evidence that SAGE has published from your journal of the 28th of February of Helliwell Abbott et al., which is appended and does talk about how it says, and I quote, in most scenarios, highly effective contact tracing and case isolation is enough to control a new outbreak of COVID-19 without 3 months. But it's notable that's appended rather than featuring in the, as it were, the reflections of the deliberations.
That's a paper, I think, from Lancet Global Health.
That's right.
But the three papers that I'm talking about are different from that, and I would really urge your committee to read them very carefully.
Thank you.
Because when you read those three papers, I think you will see the signal that was being sent, and you will wonder why it took so long.
Zara Sultan.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Dr. Horton. I want to ask you about the government's measures and the place where the NHS is currently at. So if the government relaxes social distancing and we end up seeing a second peak of cases in the winter, as some modelling suggests, how well equipped is the NHS in dealing with a resurgence of cases?
Yes, there's actually a paper being published by one of our journals today that looks at the situation in Wuhan and suggests that from
Thank you. Just some follow-up questions about what you've been made aware of in terms of NHS frontline staff. What evidence is there that the PPE we currently have is at the WHO recommended levels that's needed, and what evidence is there that best practice has been followed in terms of mitigating the risk of infection of frontline staff?
Well, I'm getting messages every single day, literally dozens of messages from doctors and nurses, porters and security staff up and down the country in the NHS, both in primary care and hospitals, walking clinics, every part of the National Health Service, telling me that WHO approved and European CDC approved PPE is not available to them. They are being given surgical masks, thin plastic aprons, plastic gloves, rubber gloves that just come up to the wrists, exposing parts of their body to aerosol infection and contamination. Often scrubs are not available. Some NHS staff have even been forced to go to B&Q and other hardware stores to buy their own face masks because it's not being provided. Now, to be fully fair, there has been, in the last few days, significant change in the provision of PPE, what's defined as PPE. Large amounts of PPE is arriving at clinics and trusts, but that PPE is not WHO approved, so it is not at the highest standard, and that means it's putting our health workers at risk. And in addition, some of that PPE, and I've posted these pictures on Twitter, are boxes where the expiry date was 2016, and other stickers have been put over the 2016 expiry date sticker, putting a date into the future. So this is PPE that is not at the highest standard and has expired. That seems to me not what we should be doing with our health workers.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Catherine.
Hello, Dr. Horton. Thanks very much for your time. It's a busy time. As I understood the early thrust of your evidence, it was concerns about delays in the UK's response, with February lost. I attended my first briefing here in the House of Commons on the coronavirus with ministers from the Foreign Office, with the Minister from Health, Joe Churchill, and also Professor Chris Whitty. I'll confirm the exact date, but it'll have been start of January, 20-something of January. And at that briefing, I think there was a lot of seriousness and understanding of the threat taken. And the very high-level architecture of the UK's response to that was set out by Professor Chris Whitty under question and has broadly, although appropriately, been moved forward. So I just wondered if you were aware that those plans were in place, including Chinese data, and does it change your earlier remarks now that you are?
Well, I haven't seen any evidence of those three papers in the SAGE advice. They're not posted on the website of SAGE, so I don't actually have the proof that work was taken into consideration in the advice of SAGE. They may well have been a briefing at the end of January, but if you look at what SAGE has posted, nowhere has it been clearly set out that you have an outbreak of a new virus that has the potential to put thousands of people into intensive care and cause thousands of deaths. That was apparent at the end of January, and our planning was not apparent even in your briefing with respect, because during the course of February and early March, what were we doing to expand that intensive care capacity? What we actually did was have a plan in which we hoped to push that curve to the right, delay the epidemic by building up herd immunity. So we actually, and Graham Medley said this on Newsnight, and Patrick Vallance confirmed it with his 60% figure, that we thought that we could have a controlled epidemic, we could manage that controlled epidemic over the course of March and April, push the curves to the right, build up herd immunity, and that way we would protect people. And that strategy, the reason why that strategy was wrong was because it didn't understand that 20% of people who became infected would end up with severe critical illness. And that was the evidence that was coming out of China in January. So that's where the fundamental mistake took place.
Dr. Norton, we're out of time. We've got several witnesses that we're seeing today. We're very grateful for your evidence. I hope you'll come back and give evidence to the committee during its inquiry. You made some important points about the coverage of the advice that SAGE is taking, especially from the international dimension, that might have implications for the course of the management of the crisis, as well as obviously lessons to be learned afterwards. And the points that you've made about equipment, I'm sure, have been received and understood very forcibly. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you very much indeed, Matt.
Thank you. We'll pause for a second while we arrange the next witnesses.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently...
Thank you. Welcome to our next two witnesses. We have Professor Andrew Pollard from the University of Oxford and Dr. Melanie Saville, who joins us by video link, who's Director of Vaccine Research and Development at the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations. Thank you both for joining us. Perhaps I can kick off by asking Dr. Saville and then Professor Pollard. What's known so far about the body's immune response to the coronavirus?
So, sorry, I'm just experiencing an echo, which is difficult to talk.
Shall I go to Professor Pollard and we'll come back to you? Our technicians may be able to adjust that. Professor Pollard.
Okay.
We know relatively little about this coronavirus so far. But because coronaviruses have been around for a long time, and we've had two major problems with outbreak coronaviruses about 18 years ago with SARS-1 and then the MERS coronavirus more recently, we do know quite a bit about the immune responses to those viruses, and that there's particularly an association with antibodies which are made against some of the proteins the virus expresses, which are very important for controlling the virus and preventing infection. So that's been really one of the major strategies for thinking about vaccine development because of our understanding from those previous coronavirus outbreaks.
Dr. Saville.
Yes, just to add to that. Indeed, we have learned a lot from other coronaviruses where it does appear that antibody is going to be important in terms of the immune response and should be a focus for vaccine development, for example.
And in terms of the potential for vaccine development, obviously it's a question on everyone's lips as to when we might get a vaccine and when it will be available to be deployed. Based on your familiarity with the work that's going on at an intense pace around the world, perhaps you might just give the committee a feel for what time frame you think we are looking at. Professor Pollard and then Dr. Saville.
The first thing to say is that, as you can imagine, there's intense and urgent efforts all around the world. There's about 30 different candidates that are being worked on in different countries. And these candidates mostly still are in that development phase and testing before you get into testing in humans. And then the next step is manufacturing after that, because we have to go through a very careful manufacturing process to make sure that when we have something in a syringe, that we know exactly what it is. The regulators have looked at it very carefully so that we have the best possible information about safety before it goes into the first person's arm. There are some vaccines that are already in clinical testing. You'll have heard in the news about one that's already being tested in Seattle, and there's also some vaccines in testing in China at the moment. So we're getting close with a number of the candidates to actually getting into people, which is where we'll start to know a bit about the safety and whether we get a good immune response with the vaccines. The next step after that is to actually see whether the vaccines work, whether it can prevent disease. And that will only be possible in settings where there's ongoing transmission. And at some point beyond that, we'll have larger numbers of individuals involved as we go through the phases of clinical trials that would provide the data needed for regulators to make recommendations for the use of the vaccine. It's likely that in this setting that if we have sufficient data from some of these products, that regulators will be able to look at emergency use regulations to think about early deployment rather than going through the very prolonged 1 year to 18 months of regulatory review even when the trials are finished. So to come back to the question of how long, it depends on really getting through those phases. If everything goes well with manufacturing and the trials are able to report early with no problems, this can be done relatively quickly, but without any shortcuts. You have to continue to have due care as you progress through this. I think the estimates of 1 year to 18 months would certainly be very likely that we'll have different candidates in that period of time which have been through all that testing. I think it's certainly possible with some candidates to be much sooner, maybe even this year, to have a lot of data on whether they work and whether they can be useful for populations.
The first phase is safety testing, and then the second is the efficacy of the vaccine. And the candidates that are being developed at the moment, with the fairest wind, what is the very earliest you think that those stages could be gone through, perhaps with some changes to procedures in a safe way that accommodated it? What's the earliest that might be?
I don't think changes in procedures are necessarily needed. I think what's happening, and globally with the regulators, regulatory reviews which may take months are being done in days because they just put more people on it, so that it's not there's any shortcuts. Manufacturing approaches are fairly standard, but everyone's trying to see whether there's more capacity to actually get there quicker rather than cut corners. So I think it's around urgency and providing the capacity to make sure that some of the normal hold-ups in process are not there. I mean, I think there will be unanswered questions because what we're talking about really in a development program normally takes somewhere around 5 years, and we're talking from a standing start of trying to do something here in months or a year. So it is a huge difference from normal practice. But I do think it's possible with a sailing wind to do that very rapidly.
Okay, Dr. Saville.
Yes, so to add to that, I would certainly agree that we need to go through the normal stages of development of a vaccine, from generating the vaccine through preclinical testing and to ensure that there is both safety and efficacy testing of the vaccine in clinical trials. And another important point indeed is the manufacturing. And in that regard, I think to reach a 12 to 18 month time frame, many activities need to be done in parallel and at risk. So with manufacturing, don't usually scale up your process until you have clinical data. But one of the approaches that CEPI is taking in terms of funding is to accelerate that scale-up of manufacturing so that it is done even at preclinical phases, so that you can move very rapidly to testing in humans in very large numbers and ensuring that we could get to hundreds of billions of doses being available globally in a time frame of 12 to 18 months. I think the other point that has already been raised is the importance of the regulators. The regulators are working very fast. There is also regulatory convergence between different regulators around the world, and this can really help advance things. So from a CEPI perspective, we are funding a number of projects. We're actually funding 8 projects currently through phase 1. And with additional funding, we'll hope to be able to fund those through the advanced development and scale up the manufacturing to allow hundreds of thousands, hundreds of millions of doses in a 12 to 18 month time frame.
On the funding side, for which you play a part in that, is the quantum of funds available within the UK, and are the processes for making that available to particular researchers, are they agile enough, would you say, for the purpose, or are there any changes that need to be made in flight, as it were? I don't know whether you caught that, Dr. Saville.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I'm terribly sorry, there is an echo, so it makes it quite difficult for me to speak and hear my own voice. But I can maybe address the funding from CEPI's perspective,
yep.
and maybe just give you a little bit of introduction of CEPI and how CEPI funds vaccine development. CEPI.
Oh, we've lost you. Let me go to. Oh, we lost you altogether. Then.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. So CEPI was formed in the wake of the 2014-2015 Ebola outbreak in West Africa, where it was recognized after decades of research that no vaccine was available. So it was recognized that an organization like CEPI was needed to accelerate vaccine development and better coordinate vaccine development for such outbreaks as the coronavirus. So we are funded by government philanthropic organizations, and specifically for the coronavirus, we have started raising funds, of which the UK government has supported us with 20 million pounds, together with other funders, which have allowed us to really advance vaccine development with a view for global access to vaccines to the population who need them most.
Is that enough for the purpose?
I'm sorry, could you...
Is that enough funding, the 20 million for the task in hand?
So with the funds that we have, and we are taking a global approach, we don't think that one government alone can solve the crisis. We anticipate that we need $2 billion to ensure vaccine development over that 12 to 18 month time frame can get to wide-scale use with hundreds of billions of doses. So we obviously do need more funding, but we really expect that to be an international effort. And in fact, the G7 meeting of last week really encouraged coordination across government for funding such as that.
So Pollard, and then I'll come to Aaron.
Yes, so just to add that the UK government has already started to make some investments in vaccine development projects here in the UK. But I think, as Dr. Saville was saying, one of the real challenges that makes this very different from normal vaccine development is you wouldn't normally invest at risk in upscaling manufacturing at this very early stage before we even have any data in humans. And if you wait for all the trials to complete before you do that, we really are years and years away. So perhaps one of the real messages is the investment needed now at risk in upscaling some of the potential products. And I think that's one thing that CEPI is already looking at from a global perspective, but perhaps we need to also be looking at that specifically from a UK perspective.
I'll turn to Aaron Bell now, but am I right in taking from the evidence of both of you that 12 months is the earliest possible time that a vaccine, with everything going right, could be available for mass deployment against the coronavirus?
I believe that 6 months is possible, but it needs a lot of things to fall in place in order for that to happen, including the upscaling to go well, for the trials to be conducted in a way that allows us to demonstrate that there's efficacy, which may be difficult with many countries in lockdown over that period, to actually see enough cases to know the vaccine's preventing them as we move forward. So there's lots of reasons why it may be more difficult to get there in that time period.
One of the things we'd be grateful after this hearing is if you'd let us know if there are any blockages that you feel should not be there and that we can draw attention to, because I think everyone shares the collective view that we should maximise the speed of deployment. Dr. Saville, on that point, you agree with Professor Pollard on this?
Absolutely, and I think it's fair to say that CEPI and CEPI's partners and everyone involved in vaccine development are doing what they can to move forward as rapidly as possible. It really is a multilateral effort. So when we talk about 12 to 18 months, we are really talking about that time frame where we would anticipate having an emergency use authorization of some description that would allow vaccines to be used outside of clinical trial protocols with really large volumes. If that can be done faster, then obviously we would do everything we could. But bearing in mind the complexity, I think it's probably best to say that if you're really looking at a very wide-scale use, it would be about 12 months.
Thank you very much. Aaron Bell.
Thank you both for your evidence so far on timeframes. It does seem that you are both quite confident that there will be a vaccine at some point. Given that we, as I understand it, have never had a vaccine for a coronavirus so far, could I just ask you to explain why you are so confident that this will be successful on whatever time frame it is?
Yes, I think, but from my perspective, that we've got many candidates being tested around the world, and we know enough about the biology of these viruses to be fairly confident that one of the directions that are being taken will be successful. Although you say we don't have a vaccine, which is absolutely true, we do already have evidence from the MERS coronavirus that some vaccines can induce strong immune responses in people. So I think that gives us some confidence that there shouldn't be any reason why this virus is different, that we could get there. And the advances in our understanding of the immune response and being able from January to have the sequence of the genome of the virus that allowed very rapid preclinical development of vaccines around the world to happen is an astonishing change from, I guess, the last big outbreak in 102 years ago in 1918 with Spanish flu, which was the last time we had something on this scale. We wouldn't have been able to do anything then. And so, I mean, we are at a remarkable place in science that allows us to get to this point so quickly, to even have these discussions.
Thank you, Professor. Same question to you, Dr. Saville, is that?
Yes, certainly. So, indeed, that we do hope that at least one of the candidates will be successful. We certainly do not anticipate that they all will. There are problems that will come along. In terms of the way that CEPI has worked, many of the organizations we are funding, including Oxford University, have experience with other coronaviruses, including some clinical data. I have to say, though, there is no efficacy data of a coronavirus in humans, but from clinical data, and certainly data in small studies in humans, suggested an immune response that may be protected.
Yeah, thank you. Coming on to the immune response, the British Society of Immunology has said that viruses related to coronaviruses do not typically induce long-term immunity. So are you able to say how long an induced immunity, whether that's through exposure or through a vaccine, would be expected to last?
I think it's a great question. It's one of the critical questions that usually gets addressed in clinical trials of new vaccines is how long does the immune response last? How long is protection likely to be? And the way that we manage that with most other diseases that we prevent through vaccination is to do the trials, look at how the duration of the response, and then often, even after deployment of vaccines, we may need to look at booster doses in the future to manage that. And you'll be aware that there are many vaccines, for example, through childhood where we give boosters. Influenza, we need to vaccinate every year. So although it's an unknown, it isn't an unknown that couldn't be addressed in the future if we need to. And I think as an exit strategy for many countries from lockdown, particularly given the comments we heard earlier about the difficulty in sustaining something that completely avoids transmission, to me, vaccines seem to be the most likely exit strategy globally.
Savile, any comments?
I do agree that is exactly what is evaluated as part of vaccine development, and that obviously needs time. I think it's also important to follow up survivors and make sure that research is being done in survivors to see what happens to the immune response after natural infection.
Yes, thank you. And on that point, would it be safe for people who have recovered the virus, would you say currently it's safe for them to stop the social distancing measures that the government has advised people taking based on your understanding? Dr. Savile?
I think that's difficult to say. What we know from the outbreak so far is that it doesn't appear that there are a lot of individuals that have been documented to shed virus on a couple of occasions. I think there are a couple of reports in China and Japan. It is probably, from what we know from coronavirus, is a reasonable assumption.
I think we already know for most viruses after you've had an infection that you have some degree of immunity, often completely sterilising immunity so you can't get reinfected, at least for a period of time. But even in those where we do get reinfections, generally they're not as severe as the initial infection. So I don't think that we should be changing any advice from government at the moment on social distancing because we don't know this for certain. But the likelihood from the biology is that we will have some protection of individuals once they've been infected.
Thank you.
Chris Larson.
That's an answer, thanks.
Okay. Any other questions? Perhaps just to follow this up, you've given a provisional answer in terms of the immunity that individuals might acquire once they've received once they've gone through COVID-19. Is there research that is seeking to be more precise about this?
So I think both in terms of following up people who have had disease, there's incredibly intense science going on that I'm aware of in the UK to try to understand the nature of the immune response, and also the nature of the inflammatory response which is causing these severe cases, and samples being collected in our hospitals from those patients. So I have no doubt that we'll have a huge amount of knowledge during the course of this year about that. As far as the immune response is concerned, exactly the same types of approaches to dissecting the vaccine response will be occurring as soon as vaccines get into trials in this country, and is happening in the US at the moment, I'm aware, with the work they're doing there on their RNA vaccine.
Dr. Savile?
Really nothing to add. I think there is a lot of research. Also to highlight that WHO are coordinating a lot of these research questions to make sure that the data can be gathered and well coordinated.
Some countries may be in a position of wanting to and being able to lift lockdowns over the months ahead. From what you've said to this committee, on the basis of a vaccine, that's unlikely to be possible for a year, possibly 6 months if everything lost all precedence. If the same timetable is in place for the analysis of the reinfectability of people that have gone through the virus, on what basis do you think people can make decisions to lift lockdowns?
That's a very good question. I mean, I think to some extent, as Neil Ferguson said earlier, until we have some experience of what happens when lockdowns are lifted, we're not going to really fully understand that. But I mean, with most infections that transmit like this, most respiratory infections, it is absolutely the case that if you still have susceptible people in the population, you will be able to reintroduce the infection and transmit again. And as he said, there will be some mitigation perhaps around season, but it's likely that you would have more transmission at some point in the future once the lockdown is lifted.
Richard?
Both for your time. I guess it's busy, so it's appreciated. I just wanted to return back to manufacturing and having manufacturing facilities available whilst a range of candidate vaccines are going through preclinical and clinical. To what extent can there be commonality in that manufacturing, or does it depend on the type of virus? Do we need 8 completely different sheds, or can we have 2 different sheds?
One first.
Probably
Melanie first, because she's got a good oversight of that.
Sure. So just as you say, CEPI is funding 8 projects. They do come under different categories, such as the nucleic acid vaccines, recombinant proteins, or vectored approaches. So there are a number of commonalities between different vaccines. So you're probably looking for 3 different types of manufacturing. And that is something that CEPI is looking at in detail for developers, is to find the manufacturing capacity. And just to give an example, we had a meeting with the Bio Association in the UK to look at their manufacturing capacity and see indeed if some of those that capacity can be linked with developers.
Well, I was just going to follow up on that. So, can you see a scenario where if we get positive data that to achieve the 6 months, we're looking again to reach out to businesses and industry in a similar way we've done with the ventilators for manufacturing of a candidate vaccine, or are we too far away from that yet?
No, I think...
So we need to do that now. We probably should have done that yesterday. Actually, we have been doing that right from the beginning, and starting to look for manufacturing capacity and be prepared to invest at risk. If you wait until you have results, you will delay the whole process by 6 months to a year for large-scale manufacturing.
Clear recommendation. These things need to be done in parallel. Professor Pollard.
That's perhaps a domestic issue for us, is that we certainly have recognised this in the UK. The UK government has invested substantially in starting to build a new manufacturing facility called VMIC. And that was a decision after the Ebola outbreak to try and improve capacity for exactly this situation. Unfortunately, that building is only just starting. So, in a couple of years' time, we'd have been absolutely ready for this. So one of the difficulties for a domestic question is that we really do need to partner with other manufacturing facilities here and elsewhere in the world in order to upscale any locally produced vaccines.
But in record speed, it can't be completed.
And I think CEPI has been instrumental in looking at different facilities around the world that are possible, as well as the work that's going on by developers here. And I think this issue of having different types of manufacturing is an important one, that for some types of vaccine, for example, the one being developed in Oxford, you have to have a cell line in which to grow the virus that we're using to make the vaccine. Other types of vaccine need a completely different process from that. And so you need manufacturing facilities that have all those processes in place to both make the vaccine, test it, make sure it's exactly what it says on the tin at the end. And those processes can take a while to put in place. So all of that has to be happening really today. And I think one of the things that's needed is investment now to make that happen.
Thank you. Sarah Sultana.
Professor Pollard, do you know if the virus mutates as it passes through the world population? And if so, how will this impact vaccine development?
Well, I think the answer to that is that at this moment there isn't good evidence that that's the case. That is a real risk and something which is going to need to be monitored, because the type of virus that it is, an RNA virus, they're actually quite liable to mutation. It hasn't happened so far, and part of the features perhaps with this virus is its success in transmitting in human populations is because it's been set quite right. The genome it has is effective for that, and it's likely it has been making some mutations as it's gone along, but then none of those have been very effective so far, and so they haven't persisted. So I think that's perhaps worrying, but also reassuring that, to my knowledge, there's no evidence of big changes so far.
Dr. Saville?
Yes, I agree. So far, it's being well monitored, and we have not seen any mutations like you might see with influenza from season to season, but that does need to continue to be monitored.
Just a follow-up question, should a vaccine be developed, and hopefully soon, who should be prioritised? Should it be a mass programme, or should it be targeted?
If I can maybe comment on that. I mean, the approach that CEPI has is really thinking that is a multilateral decision to make. I think we need to look at WHO and their mechanism for advising on vaccine use, and obviously taking into account any local situations. But work needs to be done to define who the most at risk are. And it's important for vaccine development that we do clinical trial testing in those most at risk to provide data on safety and protection.
So I completely agree with those comments that we need to have a look at exactly, from a UK perspective, where we are in the pandemic at the time that we have vaccine availability. Today, you would vaccinate a large proportion of the population if you had a vaccine, but that may look very different in months ahead. One of the challenges we're going to have is that some of the populations who are most at risk, particularly older adults, tend to make poorer immune responses to vaccines, and so we really have to get testing in those vulnerable age groups as early as possible so we understand that, and then can make some plans about how best to deploy vaccines when we have them available.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Zara's question about the mutations of the virus was actually the same as a question that our colleague Carol Monaghan, MP, submitted, so I think she'll regard that as having been answered by your response, so thank you for that. Finally, both of you talked about the global effort to develop vaccines. Would you say that the international coordination mechanisms are working well and as effectively as they need to be to maximise the opportunity of arriving at a suitable vaccine?
Well, I would say that at this moment that I'm aware of three major international efforts to coordination. Dr. Saville's already mentioned the regulatory alignment, and the regulators around the world, and that's the FDA in the United States, our regulator, the MHRA, European Medicines Agency, and all the European regulators, Chinese regulators, so really a global effort, have been getting together, discussing all of the issues about vaccine development and aligning over how that should move forwards. And they've published a document yesterday that provides some general advice on how we can move rapidly forwards. The second is the World Health Organization, and they have an oversight. They've got all the vaccine developers together from around the world and have been discussing with them what their plans are to try and get a really good roadmap of how we're moving forwards. And aligned with that is understanding what preclinical testing needs to be done before you start vaccinating humans. Also questions around how the tests should be done, what measurements of immune response should be done. So separate working groups that the World Health Organization is driving on all of those. And then lastly, to pay tribute to CEPI, who have also been coordinating a lot of global efforts, not just on the vaccines they're funding, but on many of aligning around many of these issues and bringing academic experts together to give advice as we move forwards.
Dr. Saville, you're being praised for your role internationally. Have you any advice as to whether there's more that can be done internationally, and whether governments, whether this government in particular, can be doing something that it isn't, or are you satisfied with its international engagements?
I think from the government, I mean, Prime Minister Johnson, with his discussions with the G7 and also with Chinese presidents, have really encouraged this international coordination and collaboration. And so I really feel that this is something that is critical, and that the UK government is certainly very supportive of the international collaboration.
Thank you. That's good to hear. And just finally, to kind of follow up one of the questions that Erin made, there are people in this country that have been tested for COVID-19 and have been positive and have come out of it. In fact, we took evidence from Professor Fergusson right at the beginning of this session. Can I take it from you that I will be accurately reflecting on your evidence, that the best advice that you could give is that someone like Professor Fergusson, or indeed other people emerging from a confirmed experience of COVID-19, can reinsert themselves into society without causing a risk for others that would be inadvisable?
Well, I think we do know from some of the studies following up people to see when they are no longer shedding virus, that the advice that we have is reasonably robust at the moment about people reinserting themselves in society after they've recovered from infection completely. I think that the unknowns are the contribution of the people with no symptoms to transmission, and of course we don't know who they are.
Just to say, from my perspective, obviously our priority is vaccine development, so we're not experts in that area, but obviously making sure that the vaccine development programs are well designed to address questions such as durability of protection, need for booster will help in that regard.
Thank you very much. We're very grateful. A lot of hopes of the world rest on the development of a vaccine, and the work that you're doing and your colleagues are doing in your institutions and around the world is absolutely pivotal, and we're very grateful for it. And thank you for your evidence today.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
Order, order. The committee is back in session. I'm very pleased to welcome Sir Patrick Vallance, the Government Chief Scientific Advisor. Very grateful, Sir Patrick, for your giving evidence to the committee today. And can I first start by thanking you for the extraordinary hard work and resilience that you, as leader of the scientific profession in government, are mounting in this crisis. It is deeply appreciated by everyone. And I'd be grateful if you could convey that to all of your colleagues as well.
I will, thank you. A lot of people will be very hard on it. I'd be grateful to hear that.
Thank you. You wouldn't have heard me say at the beginning of the session overall that the committee, the Science and Technology Committee, as you would expect, will inquire into the handling and lessons to be learned from the crisis. Most of that evidence will be following the hopefully satisfactory resolution of it. But it's important that we should take evidence on the way, both to capture in real time current views so that not everything is filtered through the benefit of hindsight. And secondly, if there are learnings and actions that are relevant to the ongoing conduct of the management of the crisis, it gives us an opportunity to raise them in a way that I hope that you and your colleagues will be able to find advantageous. So can I start with some questions around the structure of government scientific advice? First of all, one of the things that we don't know is the membership of SAGE, the Scientific Advisory Group on Emergencies. Is there a reason why the membership of that group, which I understand changes from emergency to emergency, but its particular configuration, is there any reason why that should not be in the public domain?
Well, first of all, let me thank you for that. The learning lessons we go along will be an important part of coming into all of this. Learning about the new virus, so it's important we can look at this very carefully. The members of SAGE, not really a membership, participants of the meeting. So we have the people who come to the table, need to come to the table. They come from a range of backgrounds, in particular emergency, and that is from clinical, virology, epidemiology, modelling, behavioural science, a range of backgrounds. Underneath SAGE, there are a series of other working groups that have membership that obviously has members as well. We have a modelling subgroup, a clinical subgroup, we have a behavioural science subgroup, we couple activities, so we form ad hoc groups as we do with certain people. So this is a rather fluid membership without the standing members in the way you have them. So publishing them becomes something that becomes a bit meaningless in a sense, because it depends on any one given meeting, rather than having a standing membership list condition.
Well, it's perhaps I could say it might be meaningful in the sense that many people think it's important that the government should be informed by the advice of scientists during this crisis. Obviously, you and Professor Whitty are visible representatives of science, but for the reasons that you've set out, you draw on the wealth of UK scientific expertise. And in order for people to understand that breadth is appropriately broad and representative, I think there would be an interest in knowing which disciplines and which institutions and individuals are represented and have the ear of you and Professor Whitty and thereby of government.
Yes, I think, as you know, we've now made the documents from SAGE, or many documents from SAGE public, and the various people who provide the mathematical models are making the models and the code available for the models. So I'm very much in favour of making as much of this open as we possibly can. And I think that is important part of scientific discipline, important part of how science normally works. I think the challenge is the one of how we get some sort of understanding of all the individuals who are involved in this public is one that I'll take. But I think it's not difficult to say here's a list of members of the state, and the state membership is a thing on fine. The only other thing I would say about making sure that our information out, which we will, all our information out, is we inevitably are something that's very turnaround from key questions. And that very quick turnaround demands them to do things that not normally do. They may revise how to get afterwards. And it's important to don't put methods in place that mean that scientists are coming up with the rules that they need to come up with quickly, which are not like what they would normally have to do. We need to make sure that we get that bit right. But I'm very much in favour of the information that comes to stage is made public and made open to others to challenge.
Thank you. I think just to refer to the to the approach that the committee is taking. There may be lessons on the way rather than just ex post, and I do think some visibility as to what disciplines are part of the advice would be important. Can I ask whether the advice that SAGE brings together and gives to you and Professor Whitty as co-chairs, has that advice been always or usually unified advice? In other words, a kind of consensus view of the group, or have there been occasions in which you've had dissenting views that you've had to put to government?
I think in your previous role, you would have come across enough time, if you get a group of 25 scientists around the table, you're not going to have a discussion in which everyone agrees every part. And it's quite appropriate. I think it's important that we challenge. So we have to challenge every stage of the process. And not all the discussions that we do are smooth and easy. Some actually obvious what the outcome is, they quickly, others require quite robust action. More challenge and we end up with the question and the uncertainty around the
Yes, looking at the evidence that has been published in recent days, quite a few of the papers are headlined, are referred to as consensus statements, and you'll recognise that, and that leads me to wonder: is there an effort at trying to bring together a single scientific view, not in the sense that there aren't different views, but to establish where the main body of scientific opinion is? Is that what SAGE tries to do, or does it set out a range of options for government?
I think what SAGE has to do is to try to take complex science and bring it to a position where we say this is the consensus view of what we're looking at now. But to be clear about the functions and purposes there are. What I think is not helpful is just to say, here is the view, and ask somebody who's less to bring together this and try to come to a single view to do that. So we do try to make sure that we come up with a consensus, but we also always clear and purposes about that and the functions line.
In your experience, when such advice has been given, following that process and that principle, in your assessment, has the government followed that advice or gone against it?
The government has listened very carefully to the advice that comes from SAGE, and I think has followed that advice closely. I think it's been really an experience of watching, wanting to hear the advice, wanting to understand the advice, and always an appropriate challenge where there are things that need to be challenged, and on occasion, of course, we've gone back and looked at that again and say and asked ourselves questions whether that needs to be re-looked at. But it's been a process science has been looking to understood very clearly.
Is there any significant aspect in which the government has chosen to take a different view from the advice that SAGE has been giving?
I think the government has followed, as I listened to the advice of SAGE very carefully and followed the advice of SAGE. And then clearly there are decisions that are made by politicians on how they want to implement that advice, and areas like that which are likely to be not scientific.
There isn't any significant disagreement, you would say, between the government and its scientific advisors on anything material. Thank you, that's helpful. Perhaps you could help us in understanding what you will have picked up and understand to be one of the criticisms, or well, let's say just questions, that the consensus of UK science as reflected in the advice to government and through the published papers has been at variance with what might be described as overseas scientific opinion, principally in Asia, but sometimes in the continent of Europe. How is it possible in a set of disciplines that is global that there can be a markedly different approach that is being recommended in one part of the world than another?
Well, I'm just reminding you what the strategy is laid out for. It was initially contained, and I think that was very much the aim, to in cases ultimately contact tracing and public government will effort trying to do that. This became the answer, which by definition means that it is no longer possible everywhere in the world. So that containment phase, which was very successful in some cases early on, before the example, we tried to contain here as part of good, and I think it's a lot to actually lay these instructions. After that, our approach was, I think, basically the same as the rest of the world, and it happened to different time frames depending on what we have to find. And that's first and foremost, we try to stay in and to reduce the number of people who got infected. That means reducing the overall peak, trying to get that down as far as we could, and obviously critically important to keep that below the NHS ICU capacity. And secondly, to shift it to the right, try to delay it a little bit, and thirdly, to make sure that those vulnerable people were adequately protected during the time, during the time which the infection was most prevalent. And those were the principles that we built recommendations around. And they are basically the principles that everybody can follow. The question then comes into the speed and the extent to do those at what stage of the outbreak. And we were clear, basically an example of protecting the vulnerable, that the measures that would be in place are obviously quite extreme, and we need to ensure that vulnerable people are protected when the infection is there to be protected from. There's a timing issue there, and there are clearly timing issues around when to introduce the numerous different interventions that are important and to delay an epidemic. We laid those out very well. Stage first met in January, and we've been discussing this for many meetings. What we laid out quite early on what the various interventions were that will be needed to try and protect the food. And through a consensus position modelling, what the likely impact of those different measures on the size of the peak, on the delay of the peak, and the number of deaths. The rollout and implementing that was about trying to make sure that the most impactful, the ones with the biggest effect, were done first and were done properly, and the others were added to the all. And that's the approach we've taken. I don't think, in essence, that's very different from what many of the other countries have done. It is different from what countries are able to have a very robust containment strategy early on, like Singapore did in that first wave, although of course Singapore is in a different position now.
So one of the differences that one observes from the evidence that's been published, and there is now a lot of the papers that SAGE has published are about particular interventions such as closing schools and about the social isolation of the vulnerable. There is comparatively little reference in the papers to testing and contact tracing, despite the fact that there are some appended papers to the evidence published, including from the Lancet, that suggest that in countries like South Korea and Hong Kong and Singapore, that testing and contact tracing has been the most important early intervention. That doesn't have, I would say, the same degree of prominence in the evidence that is before the public as to what SAGE has considered.
The first few meetings we had were saying that all totally dominated by the question of contact tracing and containment and isolation and testing. So those were the early methods that we had, and testing for example, in terms of being able to do that through Public Health England, and be aware that for a long time the UK was the biggest testing nation in levels now, and we have to up to over 90,000 tests now. So testing has been on, if not on the agenda, I should think it's been on the part of the agenda to say about testing. At the beginning, it was in the context of testing and contact with regulation. Over the more recent times, it's been very much about sending us testing and making sure that testing is right level to be able to do much wider testing. And I think that is a crucial thing to do. And there's two types of testing that we're focused on and not discussed around. One is around detection of viral infection itself, and bigger numbers, and public health groups, and Mark Helton, social care has worked very hard to try that testing increase. There are proposals very fast, and helping do that. That's very important. The second type of testing that a lot of time talking about is serology testing. So this is the testing for antibodies who had infection. And very early on, we really pushed that that needs to be done through the public health England developed the serology test, and there are others who now got to I've seen the first results of that sort of testing coming through now, and that needs to be ramped up. So I think if that is reflected in the paper, it's certainly very long part of
We have changed the policy towards testing in that it was, until a couple of weeks ago, available in public settings through drive-in test centres. It's now reserved for inpatients in hospitals to be broadened to NHS workers. We understand that. Why was it not possible to continue the expansion so that we would be able to cover inpatients, to cover NHS staff and care staff, but to maintain and indeed expand the testing in the public setting of people with symptoms at the very least?
There, at the moment, isn't enough testing to do all the things we really need to get on with. So, emphasis on that testing is key, and that's why there are proposals to get to 110,000 per day tests. What's being worked on at the moment in terms of detecting active infections. There are measures being taken to put into a big testing facilities around the UK, in addition to the public health England testing, and I think that really needs to happen in order to get through. Until we get up to those numbers, then the decision, I think, is the right one. It may test patients in hospital and try to test healthcare workers, and that's pragmatic reality. We can pick enough of the testing, the better it will be in terms of being able to test our
And is there anything that you think could have been done at an earlier stage to have expanded the number of tests or the capacity for testing available?
Well, I wish we had more tests available today. So, in that sense, it would be great to go ahead of this more than we've been able to do. But it's not easy to ramp up testing for that scale. I mean, it's technically difficult to do. I reiterate the point that the UK was actually the fourth largest sector in the world, but we were not certain around, but was absolutely the case that we need to get many more now. And there's a very industrial size effort to get up to the last number of getting to. And we need to get them not only now, but also, and this is an important thing to look at, as we go through this, and once we start to relax the measures in place, testing is going to be a critical part of that. So, I can't overemphasize the testing right. And then my final point, it's important to scale testing, it's also critically important. There is a very real problem with things in rush and you that give you false negatives or positive. And it's important that we do this with the right quality. And I'll give you an example. If you were to test company and get a false negative, you've done a disservice. They then think that they're okay to go around back to work or whatever and install more problems. We need quality to be right. And that is definitely difficult to do at scale. And I know many people very hard to do.
Thank you. You mentioned the serology test and how important that is to see who might have gone through having the virus without knowing about it. When will that be deployed? You say it's already being tested now. Give us an idea of when we might expect to see the widespread rollout of that and what kind of pace.
The serology is public health and epidemiology working. There's a proposal to do a community-based study of that, looking at different age groups, and one of the big unknowns in this epidemic is what proportion of people get asymptomatic infection. There are papers, for example, in Wuhan, that suggest that over 80% of people are unaffected in Wuhan, and there's a paper from Italy that over 70% of they tested for asymptomatic. But we don't really know. So the first priority with the epidemiology is to try to get a handle on that number. We then need to ramp up the quality testing, and that's where the quality tests that people have mentioned, a much more self-administered finger prick test that you could do, are potentially the answer to that. It's very important that these tests are properly validated, that we understand again false positive, false negative. So the lab-based test is up and running to about 4,000 tests can be done in that per week. At the moment, that's going to ramp up. And the first study will be this community-based study, which we should be seeing results on over the next few weeks.
When do you expect that type of testing to be available at scale across the country?
The tests, the finger prick type tests, are being ordered and looked at now, and if those are effective, I think that needs to be tested to make sure it's clear about the effectiveness and sensitivity and specificity of the test. If that can be done quick, I think we need to make sure that we've got the right parameters around those tests before we roll them out. And that's something that DHS and others are looking at now.
The summer or later in the year that we're talking about?
I think it could be sooner than that. If these tests work, that can be done quickly.
I see.
So just to be clear, that is the absolutely desired aim. And if we can put this out quickly, that will make a huge difference over the testing.
I understand, I'm grateful. In terms of taking the best scientific advice into government and taking policy decisions on that, I wonder whether you can give some clarification from your scientific vantage point on whether people should work if they can work, if they can't work from home, but they can work 2 meters apart from each other. If they're not in a designated critical occupation, providing they can meet that distancing requirement and can't work from home, is it okay for them to work?
Well, first of all, I think I can commend you on being 2 meters apart. I can't quite judge from the photo. And I think the aim of the social distancing and other measures in place is to break transmission between households. That's essentially what we're trying to do. If you break transmission between households, that allows the whole thing to come down. Then you try to get the R value below 1. And the R value is the number of people average by 1/3. And when you get that below 1, that means the epidemic is out of control. That's the aim, it's about breaking transmission to account for all the measures we want to take. That's money to do that. The best way to do that, of course, is to extend their own houses and not go on. The work situation to make it impossible for certain types of work and for certain types of essential work, including these houses, but many others as well. So the advice is clear. People should stay at home. Home work is absolutely what should be done wherever it's possible to do so. And then there are some situations where it's not possible. And in those situations, staying 2 meters apart is ridiculous.
Will it be necessary, in your view, for people to work in settings where they can distance themselves from each other that may not be listed as critical occupations in order perhaps to provide components to something that is critical?
Yes, I think those are things that need to happen. I mean, we need to keep things going. The health service, now it's all to make sure that this work. It's very obvious to the doctor, but I'll give you an example. It's rather important that we continue to discover new substances and actually put them.
Let me turn to Aaron Bell.
Thank you, Sir Patrick. Just briefly on the public health interventions, and essentially it seems that there are a succession of levers that you have, or interventions if you like, that you want to pull. It's just a question of the timing at which we pull those. Is that a fair characterisation?
Yes, that is a fair characterisation, and that's what we're trying to do.
And so are there further levers that are in reserve, or are we now at maximum leverage, as it were, in terms of what we're going to ask the public to do?
I think you heard from Neil Ferguson earlier on, who's one of the more inputting to say, and by the way, we have lots of more, but Neil is certainly the leading one in this. The measures that have been put in place, the compliance, which now looks as though should be enough to bring it down to a normal overnight. And so those measures, which mention the right time, the right way, should get this below the line. And that's the aim. And I think we would be quite, you know as well as I do, really extraordinary measures in place now in terms of the effect on society and the way we live. And those measures, you never say the next page or those measures really should be enough to bring it below the line. And I reiterate, now clear if what is going on. And we should expect with a time delay of 2 or 3 weeks after that going down there.
Thank you, Sir Patrick. If I could briefly turn to communications, which are obviously part of the strategy, how we communicate that out to the public. Firstly, could I say thank you for your efforts in this regard, Professor Whitty and Dr. Harries. I know it's not a role you sought, but I think you've been very reassuring to the public in your appearances. Could I ask what scientific advice has gone into the overall communication of what we're asking the public to do?
In the table that we published from Sage, where we looked at what the interventions were that could be looked at and what effect size they would have, we also have tables describing what the behavioural implications of that were and how we could be communicated from a behavioural science point of view. So there's been quite a lot of work done on that, and very clear as well on behavioural science, a number of different groups which has been given in the government communication process.
Thank you. And obviously we have a free press, but I really would like to ask you what you think their role needs to be in this situation, this epidemic. I mean, is there a case for some sort of agreed voluntary code on how they report on this, given the public health concerns? For example, whether they should be emphasising compliance rather than the exceptions, things like that. I'm asking really for a scientific judgment, not a journalistic one, because I appreciate there's a balance here.
You know, I was getting quite close to not being science, but
yes.
You're obviously good to answer that, and I'm not sure that I can really comment on what papers should or should do in this. But I mean, what I would ask is that papers try and follow the sort of responsible line that's being laid by the government, and it is important to encourage people to be compliant with it. And I think the message that I would like everybody to hear is while many people will get a disease which is mild or moderate, the aim of intervention is to protect everybody. And if we don't do it, if we allow household transmission to take place, then we put other people at considerable risk. And so making sure that these measures are really understood and that people understand the impact of behaviours which don't then allow them to adhere to the I think it's going to cause problems. So I'd like, as always, that communication come out clearly and be supported in the papers. But I can't go beyond that.
No, understood. Thank you, Sir Patrick.
Chris Thompson.
Thank you, Sir Patrick. And obviously, I'd like to reiterate the comments about the work you're doing. I think, very trying times, you've actually been very effective. I just wanted to come back to the social distancing piece very briefly. The documents published by SAGE on the 20th of March recommended an alternating period of looser and stricter social distancing controls. Is there a scientific reason for that? Is that better than a single period?
Well, one group of modelling that came through the sort of IM process. I think where we are now is very focused on applying these fully the R1. What we absolutely need to do now. The question, and this is a question that everyone's asking across the world, is once you touch the R1, what is the right capacity to start releasing from that? And you've really got a number of questions there. One of them is to link and monitor, and then perhaps go from the beginning buttons. The other is to release altogether and things happen, or to release part. And I think that question of can we start taking off these measures and monitoring the effect is one we're going to have to really do, and monitor carefully so we can adjust depending on what we see. But I don't have an answer. I don't really know what the answer is exactly the right way to do that. And that modelling is one way to do it, have follow-up periods.
Thank you. And sorry, I've got one more follow-up. We're also now following a strategy with the most at risk of shielding, which will involve things like deliveries of food and medicine. Is there any risk of the disease actually being transmitted to those people via food deliveries or medicine deliveries?
Well, there obviously is a risk if the people doing it go into the house and get close contact. So that's why what should happen is that the deliveries should be left in a place where somebody can get them without being exposed into direct contact, if that's possible to do that. And it's clearly important. Nobody delivers to people if they've got any symptoms at all. So I think the measures that have been advised by public government and how to do this should protect the individual as far as possible and try not to go into that. In some cases, really in care homes and places where you are going to need to have contact and take the appropriate measures to protect them.
Sorry, just to expand on that, so there's no chance of actually transmitting it via the actual food itself?
The survival of the virus on hard surfaces maybe for 48 hours or so, and then it falls off quite quickly after 24 hours. On soft surfaces, it's actually much less than that. So that there's no probability of eating it through the food in the way you said, but of course, you've got to wash the right fruit before you eat it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Patrick. In the Imperial College report dated 16th of March on non-pharmaceutical interventions, it states that mitigation is no longer a feasible strategy after refining the estimates of likely ICU demand in Italy and in the UK. And it goes on to say that previous planning estimates assumed half the ICU demand now estimated. Given that the government has updated its strategy, the most effective mitigation strategy would involve exceeding ICU demand eightfold. Dr. Fergusson, in the previous session, said this would now potentially be threefold with the new measures that have been introduced by the government. Does this imply that the previous mitigation strategy still involved exceeding ICU bed capacity by some amount?
Oh, well, look, there was absolutely no intention to ever exceed the isomicity. I mean, that's not a strategy, and that's rather been one. The mitigation, of course, has two parts to it, which apply and demand work. And what we need to do, and what's being done at the moment, is to suppress the demand side, to try and suppress the numbers as far as we can, and at the same time, scale up the NHS capacity so that it's got the fair needed to do that, and that's what we need at the moment. I can't complete and move guarantee that there will not be occasions when an individual places 5 people you get free. I mean, that's always the main possibility, and of course, in winter anyway, the pressure comes. So there's no guarantee that you can stay within that. But as the various different we've looked at now, with measures in place now, the increase in enterprise capacity that's being forecast and talking by the NHS, this looks like a new track to try to stay within that capacity limit, and that's clearly what we need to do.
Thank you. Just to follow up, with the previous optimum mitigation strategy that the government was pursuing, there were figures of how many people were expected to perhaps pass away from the virus. Was there a number of mortality figures that were seen that appeared tolerable, in your opinion?
Well, I think as I said at the beginning, it's difficult to find any strength to death tolerable, and so our aim from the outset was to make sure we minimise death and suffering, and try to make sure that the most vulnerable were protected, and that has always been the aim of what we've been trying to do. Now, there is a common situation that we need to know over what time future occurs, and there's a balance between this going on for a very, very long time or going on for a short time, and what options that need to be looked at. But I think there was never should be that there was a correlation to death. So one of the reasons were not there so far, which is always happens in this situation, trying to say if things are out of work reasonable case, I you concentrate, control it, what the number of deaths and the number of effects you end up with. And that's the reason the worst case scenario is supposed to have.
And just to very quickly finish, Dr. Horton just previously mentioned warnings that were coming out of China before the World Health Organization officially declared the pandemic on the 11th of March. There were also warnings that if the virus spread beyond China, it could become a global pandemic. This was around January. Given that, what was the reason for the government's delay in seeking the resources it needs to deal with the pandemic? For example, leaks to journalists only this weekend show that a senior Downing Street aide wrote to research institutions asking to make use of their testing equipment.
I'm not sure I'll answer the second part, but I'll answer the
So, only this weekend there are leaks coming out that Downing Street is requesting access to use testing equipment.
Yeah, so this is about testing scale up, and clearly there are bits of equipment all over the place in the UK, and the question is whether they can be utilised in some way which then gets to the industrial scale of test. So that's entirely appropriate thing to try to do. In terms of the indications that it could be a pandemic, very early on, and I think the CMO put this pretty well, there were really two things that happened at the time. Either China contained it completely and it would have gone away, and that was one possibility, and the other was they wouldn't contain it, it would spread and it would become a pandemic. And early in January, it wasn't clear which of those was going to be the case. And as things have gone on, it became clear, I think in January, that this was testing in a direction where it wouldn't infect each other and it would spread. the official declaration of the pandemic by the government, Joe, is obviously in their hands to decide when they'll make that decision. But by then, of course, we were planning absolutely that we go across the world, and already see it spread in a number of places. And I spent time, and Chris Whitney spent time making sure that we spoke to our colleagues in other countries to learn what was happening there as well. So I think that spread of the pandemic became inevitable at some point during that time, probably before the WHO declared the pandemic. It looked like it was in that position.
Thank you.
Patrick. Zara mentioned Dr. Horton. In his evidence before us this morning, he wondered whether there was sufficient clinical representation on SAGE. Can you clarify that for us?
Well, rather unusually, both the government chief scientific advisor, me, and both medics, and we also have the NHS medical director on SAGE itself. But we have a number of clinicians around the table, including also from Public Health England, that we've got quite a proportion of SAGE is actually clinical, but clinically for us, there is a clinical subgroup that feeds into SAGE, which has all clinicians on it. Do a lot of the work that then comes in on the clinical aspect. So there are lots of people involved in the process of second stage and informed part of consideration. And it is crucial because the modelling is one form of evidence. The real understanding of what it means to be in the hospital, clinical, to have patients in front of you, and the different players. And it's why the makeup of SAGE is so important in the different disciplines we have around the table.
Thank you, we're grateful. Mark Logan.
Yes, Sir Patrick, just some questions around the science advice to governments, and just want to understand a little bit more about why it took until the 20th of March for SAGE to publish the evidence informing its advice to government.
So SAGE historically has never published any of this information until afterwards it publishes things, and so this is a departure actually. It's one I personally welcome. I think it's important we do get the evidence out there. It took a while to get it into the right shape, get it out there, and get the permission from Victor because we're reliant on the papers and the information that come from contributors to SAGE, and that's their proprietary information. Everyone thought was very critical to the public. And I think that is the change to the way SAGE has worked historically, and one I personally welcome.
And finally, who took the decision to publish this evidence from SAGE?
Well, it was taken by me as a go SAGE leader.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Just reflecting on the evolution of the approach that we've taken in this country. I mean, it seems to me, reading all of the evidence that's been published, that it really divides into two phases. The first phase was a belief or an assumption that most people in the UK would contract the coronavirus one way or another, and a certain scepticism of what might be called the Asian approaches. Looking at the paper of the 26th of February, for example, the potential effect of non-pharmaceutical pharmaceutical interventions. The paper, the SAGE paper, says implementing all the measures, the suppression measures, would result in a second epidemic once they were lifted. The paper of the 9th of March, the potential impact of behavioural and social interventions, says that implementing a subset of the measures would be ideal. Whilst this would have a moderate impact, it would be much more likely to result in a second wave. In comparison, to reduce a second wave, in comparison, combining stringent measures as a long-term policy may have a similar impact to Hong Kong or Singapore, but this would result in a large second epidemic once the measures were lifted. So I discerned that. Then there was a shift And a shift to suppression. We've obviously had evidence in person from Professor Fergusson and of course his colleagues' famous study showing the capacity of the healthcare system. That is obviously one very important reason for that shift. Is that the reason for the shift? And was it not possible to have accurately modelled the balance between the demands on the NHS and its capacity to supply intensive care unit beds earlier than in March?
The figure of most of the population becoming infected was a reasonable worst case scenario. And that was derived from what the constrained epidemic would do. And the figure of 8% is the upper figure you get to if you have an unconstrained epidemic. So that's basically what you have in the epidemic, the unconstrained upper figure. It wasn't a prediction of what would happen. And of course, wherever you look at this, it doesn't look like anything close to 8% of the population coming back. So that was a reasonable worst case scenario. We were concerned, and remain concerned about the second wave, and of course that was quite a feature of, for example, the 1980 pandemic, pre-pandemic. The second wave caused these more deaths than the and so the second wave is something that remains a concern. And the more likely, the more you suppress it down to zero early on, the more likely you are to get the current system. So this is a very difficult thing to try and balance. And what we're trying to do is get them up below the ICU, keep them there, allow some release of those measures, and also for treatments that are being looked at, and vaccine hopefully will come along one day. But we need to make sure that we allow the ICU numbers to breathe. And the model that Neil Ferguson and many others did right from the beginning has made that, I think, the range of possible outcomes.
We've taken evidence today that a vaccine is unlikely to be available before 12 months, and I think you've said much the same. There was the outside possibility that it might be 6 months, but that was an outlier rather than something that we could rely on. So if we are to be suppressing in the way that we are, without a vaccine, are you anticipating a second wave later in the year?
I think that goes back to the answer I gave earlier on, that this is true across the world. It needs to press, and we need to start relaxing indicators. With what's happening in many countries, we're now in the process of trying to keep our value below that. As we release those measures, we're going to have to monitor very carefully what happens in terms of an increase in infection. You can see that happening basically increased number of infections now occurring, having very successfully contained it early on. That's going to be something that we have to measure as we go along. I don't know for sure if a big second wave as a result of that, or we can say on its own, that's one thing we've got to be very concerned about, something to keep an eye on. And I think we can't do anything now other than suppress and then release those and monitor and deal with that area.
I see. Shot through the early papers that have been published, is this great concern about a second wave in the winter, and obviously the capacity of the NHS currently to absorb critically ill patients has been very, very influential in determining the change of approach. But I haven't detected any revision of that concern and anticipation of a second wave. And I was struck by one of the papers published in Evidence, paper from the SPIB group, Insights on Public Gatherings, published given to the committee on the 12th of March. And what that advice to SAGE said was that acting in a way that does not meet expectations poses a risk that a section of the public will view government actions as incompetent or not in the public's best interests. SPIB has pointed out repeatedly that trust will be lost in sections of the public if measures witnessed in other countries are not adopted in the UK. So can I ask Patrick, to what extent is the adoption of measures that have been adopted by other countries complying or driven by compliance with that advice of SPIB, that we need to be seen to do that for public confidence, or to what extent does it reflect a change in the very solidly argued early assessment that we must act to prevent a second epidemic?
Well, there's several questions up in that one. On the point of procedures, we laid out what the measures are that we do early on, and those measures need to be implemented at the right time, and that's the part that we. Mass gathering was one of the very early ones that caused quite a because it was not good. And you could see several people going early to mass gathering. The point that we discussed, and I think it's laid out in the paper, is that banning mass gatherings alone is a very ineffective way to try and stop this problem. And that's why we shouldn't do it early. We need to think as matter early and concentrate on getting those things done early. We also say that mass gatherings are part of a broader social distancing program where you're also talking about smaller, more intimate gatherings that do spread more readily would be a sensible thing to do. So the mass gatherings actually only came in at the time that we were also dealing with other types of gatherings in greater social. And that was the reason that mass gatherings came in at that point. The second part of the question.
So the mass gatherings was an instance, but the point of that paper that the committee, that the advisory SAGE took, was that the advice was that we should take measures that other countries are doing, because if we didn't, there would be a fall in public confidence. And so what I was getting at was, are we taking these measures because others are doing it, with some private scepticism continuing, as you evidenced before on this? You know, it's if you can't beat them, join them kind of approach. Or is there a reappraisal of the actions that are needed?
Well, none of those. It's that we laid out all the measures and said, as we monitor the epidemic, you may need to work through those and pull all of those levers. And all of those levers have been pulled. Well, not all of them, I mean, there are other things you could do, but the levers have been pulled to get us there. So it was a tightening thing, and the reason that it became necessary to enforce compliance law for this is because without good compliance, it didn't look like we were getting the numbers down below the ICU capacity, and therefore we had to do that. So it was not in response to what others were doing and saying we need to look like them, following the trajectory that we put out, implementing those policies, making sure we compliance was, and when we saw that compliance was enough, that was the question, what needs to happen to compliance greater, and that's
Thank you. I'm grateful. And finally, just going back to testing and the rollout of new tests and making that more widely available, is that now an operational matter for the government and the NHS, or is it something in which you and your colleagues in SAGE continue to have an important role in setting policy on?
No, it's largely an operational matter. It's certainly a matter that we continue to look at because it's so important for the approach to being able to monitor this going forward and release the measure. So it's operational.
Thank you. And in Professor Ferguson's evidence, he gave some comfort that the capacity of the NHS, with the measures that have now been taken, is likely in aggregate to be sufficient, which is obviously important news. Just finally, as a kind of wrap-up, can you give the committee and those watching this a feeling for what length of time you would expect the current measures to be in place and to have a significant effect?
If you look at what's happened in other countries, if you take the measures that we've taken, you start to see a change in terms of the R value within 2 weeks or so. If you measure ICU patients for maybe 2 to 4 weeks, and as I said, everybody is R now at the low time and they're almost down. I'd like to give you some indications of timeline, not scale. The scale is being made for different countries, the timeline over which you start to see this coming down. But getting it under control, there is hard work one, and the epidemic goes down. I think you can see follow that sort of number. Then the question is the important one is what can you politically to allow this to go forward? How do you monitor that? And which ones need to stay in place longer than others in order to achieve what it is? And this is only starting now in China, where measures are being relaxed. Apparently, we see what happens in terms of the disease and the outbreak. And I can't give you an answer to what happened there. We observe and we need to think about what we need to do here in response.
Patrick, thank you very much indeed. As you said much earlier in our discussion, my experience of working with scientists and indeed yourself in government is that science often does involve disagreements and arguments, and in fact that's the way it proceeds, testing hypotheses. So that is inevitable. I feel sure that having observed the structures that we have, it is a good thing that we have people of your calibre and supported by others advising in government. This is a time, we know, of great work and pressure on you. We're very grateful for your public service during this time.
Thank you. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the many, many scientists who input into this work and work day and to try and get some of this information available. I'm extremely grateful.
Thank you, Sir Patrick. At the beginning of the session, we conveyed similar thanks, and I reiterate it now through you. Thank you.
Thank you.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
Order. Committee back in session. We're very pleased to have Professor Sharon Peacock, who's the Director of the National Infection Service at Public Health England. Thank you very much indeed for joining us at a very important time. Professor Peacock, could you describe briefly what are the main diagnostic tests that are available for COVID-19?
Yes, so I would divide that into two types. The first is what we call an antigen test, which detects the presence of the virus in people who have COVID-19, who are sick with it. And there's a variety of ways of detecting it, but fundamentally is that you detect the virus test. The second type of test is an antibody test. That's looking for the immune response or evidence of the immune response after somebody has had the illness and has recovered. So the difference is that the antigen test you do at the time of illness, and the antibody test you need to do later into the illness, at least 7 days after the start of the symptoms.
Thank you. And tell us about the stage of development and deployment that we are in this country on both, if you would.
Yes. Okay. So the antigen test, we were one of the first people to develop an antigen test, and that was done in Colindale. So within a very short space of weeks, we had a test that was operational, and that was to detect the antigen. We subsequently rolled that out to a total of 8 laboratories in the first instance, which were either PhD laboratories or linked with PhD, so that we could develop capacity. We then rolled that out to further NHS laboratories. So now we're in a position where we're ramping that up to the NHS network. So if I look at the numbers in terms of where we're going with the actual numbers, so by the 13th of March, we'll have a capacity of 11,900 antigen tests per day for patient care. So I'm just focusing on use patients coming into hospital in the first instance. And by the 6th of April, we'll have 15,000, and by the 25th of April, we aim to have 25,000 tests. Now, this is being ramped up throughout the NHS network. There are 29 NHS laboratory networks, but we've needed a new paradigm to increase our numbers, and so we have full NHS capacity pretty much as they function at the moment. And what we're doing is we're putting in a very high throughput machines in some laboratories, including one in London and Manchester as from the 30th of March, which will give us a much higher throughput per machine.
And how long does it take the results to come from each of these tests?
Doing the test actually takes around 4 hours. The actual time that it takes will depend on the duration of travel of the sample from the patient to the laboratory. It then takes, in total, about 10 hours to process the specimen. So we have to do some pre-processing, and then we do the test. So we can get the laboratory to have a result within a day, and then the result goes out to the clinician. So it will depend, there's some variability in the time that it takes to get the test to the lab, and that will depend on the proximity of the patient to the laboratory, and then getting the result out through the NHS system and into clinicians, which is going by the usual route for patient care.
So the development of the testing capability, this is something, obviously the virus is a global virus, and so the same tests apply in every country in the world. So why is this why is it required a national programme of development to source our own test?
Well, when COVID-19 very first arose, nobody had a test for COVID-19, so it was completely novel. And we were approached by WHO to be one of 3 reference laboratories. And it's important that there is a diversity of people developing tests, because you need to do that at pace. And everybody, because they're in-house tests, then you need to be able to compare your results to other people's. So there was a major effort from numerous countries to develop a test, but now that you look back and compare them, they're all actually very similar. So our test was based on one that was done in collaboration with Germany, but the tests elsewhere are actually quite similar, certainly in terms of format. So it was a case of everybody acting as rapidly as possible and trying to act within country as well as interacting with the WHO and other countries.
Let me take a question from Zara.
Thank you. I have a question regarding the 2016 exercise where the UK government ran exercise Cygnus, in which they looked at a national pandemic flu, and that highlighted the necessity of ventilators. What was learnt from this, and do you know why there's such a shortage of ventilators currently in the UK?
I think that I would say that this is an unprecedented pandemic, which I think it would have been difficult to plan for. However, we do have enough ventilators for patients at the moment, and I think that the rapid scale-up of ventilator availability in the coming weeks is aiming to match demand with supply. I think that it's a question of this outbreak has been of an unprecedented size, and so, but it's reasonable to use what we have, which we have existing capacity at the moment, and then increase our availability rapidly now, which is the plan of the government.
Thank you. A follow-up question about the high levels of mortality we're expecting to see. How is Public Health England preparing to deal with the high numbers of bodies, essentially, and what do the most effective disposal procedures look like?
Yes. I mean, this is obviously a very sensitive issue, and it's one that the NHS will be dealing with in particular, rather than PHE. What I would say is that the case fatality rate we would expect to be around 1%. And if it's any higher than that, that's because we detect the most severe cases that are in hospital rather than in the community. So at the moment, the case fatality rate is somewhat higher than that, but over time, as we get more data, we expect that the case fatality rate will be around 1%. Now, in terms of deaths, when this sadly occurs, Public Health England has developed guidelines on how to deal with deceased individuals, and that is available on the gov.uk website. So we do have guidelines on how to deal with deceased people. And in terms of mortuary capacity, this would actually be an NHS issue, and I know that they are planning around this through their worst case scenario planning.
Just a final question. Given the likely costs, both in human costs and economic costs of the current epidemic, how much money globally should be allocated to research and protection and prevention measures against the next one?
Yes, that's a really important question. But I have to say that I haven't been involved in the economics, and I think that I would need to, if you wish an answer to that, I'd need to take that away and confer with people that would be able to give you an accurate answer. So apologies that I can't answer that right now.
That's okay. Thank you. Thanks.
Can I just put a couple of questions which are similar from two colleagues that can't be here, Graham Stringer, MP, and Carol Monaghan, MP. Graham asks why the UK doesn't have the same capacity to test as Germany, and Carol has asked why it is that the Republic of Ireland is testing 3 times as many people per head of the population as the UK.
Yeah, thank you. So our capacity to test, so we've obviously looked at numbers of tests being done elsewhere, and in the early phases of the disease, we were testing a large number of people compared with others. What I would say is that we will start to see these numbers rise very rapidly now because the government have a 4-point plan for increasing testing, and so we would anticipate increasing our testing of sick patients to 25,000 per day by the end of April. There's also plans by the government to develop mass testing of key workers for the antigen up to 100,000 or more tests per day, and those plans are rapidly rolling out. So I think that the current situation we're meeting the most critical demand, which is our sick patients in hospital. And over the coming days, you will see an increase in the number of people being tested.
When will the 100,000 key workers be reached?
Pardon?
When will the 100,000 capacity for key workers be reached?
Well, there's early work going on in Century, Milton Keynes, and so they're standing up their capability now. And so I'd anticipate that in the near future that will be available to key workers. What I would also say is that the tests being developed through the NHS, once there's sufficient capacity, will also be made available to key workers if there is capacity over or after group testing patients.
Do you, given my colleagues' questions, are you benchmarking what is being done in other countries like Germany, the Republic of Ireland, obviously more famously South Korea? They obviously have installed a capacity that is greater than ours in terms of the coverage of the population. I assume, are continuing to increase that capacity. Are you studying what they're doing and looking to replicate it?
We are studying what they're doing, but not necessarily to replicate it. So in South Korea, they managed to increase their testing by having testing running in 79 laboratories. We don't intend to run the test in 79 laboratories. We're taking a different model. We believe that we need a centralised high-throughput sequencing for key workers together with a distributed network of tests in the NHS so that we can actually test our sick patients. So yes, we are looking at how people are operating, but this is our model, that we have a distributed NHS network of testing together with a very high throughput capability in a given piece.
So given what you've described as the South Korean model of being more distributed with 79 testing centres, Public Health England have chosen a different model. Can you explain why we've rejected the South Korean model in favour of this particular approach?
That's a good question. I'm just thinking about how I would respond to that. I think that we need to build on the strengths of the NHS. And the NHS actually have 29 laboratory networks around the country, so I think building on our existing capability is key for us. And once we've exhausted that capability, we then have two options. We could either open up numerous different laboratories in universities or in other hospital settings, because laboratories in this country have been largely merged, so that we have a smaller number of large laboratories. Well, the alternative was to actually have a single large testing site. And from my perspective, it's more efficient to have a bigger testing site than trying to dissipate our efforts into multiple different laboratories around the country.
Given that the handling of this epidemic has been informed by the science continually, we've taken evidence from many scientists today and the government chief scientific advisor just before you. The decision that's been taken to follow a different model of testing than South Korea, is the evidence based for that published, and the rationale for it published in a way that it can be scientifically interrogated?
It's not published at the moment, but we'll be looking at the model that we've used in an exercise. I think the key thing is to, a straight answer is it's not published at the moment. So we could make that available, we could do that as an analysis, and we will be doing that analysis of how we've operated compared with other people. And
can you say when that might be published so that people can comment on it and perhaps come up with some different perspectives on it?
Yes. Well, we need to take that away. We need to do it in the next few days so that you're able to see that.
Right. But it is an example of an intervention, a very important intervention, that has been foundational for the handling of the virus by many countries. And in a regime in which we're basing it on the science, it seems a little surprising that the evidence base and the rationale for that is something that is not subject to scrutiny by other scientists.
Well, the program of testing has been discussed extensively actually by our scientists. The plan of rollout for testing was developed as a 4-point plan, and that got widespread agreement in terms of the models. And so it has had support from our scientists and others.
Is there any reason why the approach that you described of the sequential approach of using public laboratories and then NHS laboratories and then others in the universities, that's a sequential approach. Is it not possible to do everything at once?
The test that we used required particular reagents, and so that we needed to scale up use of those reagents. So, for example, the test that we were using required growth of virus and other reagents. So the scale up seemed like a reasonable approach to us. In retrospect, we could have looked at other approaches, but that was the approach that we chose at the time.
I see. Let's turn to my colleagues. Catherine?
No, I do want to thank you for giving us your time. You've got 1 or 2 things on at the moment, and everyone's extremely grateful. I think what would be wonderful is the 1-sentence reply to the lady that wrote to me yesterday saying, my wife's a nurse and she's got a cough and she's frustrated because she wants to go to work and she hasn't got the test. So the answer is, what's the 1 sentence from Public Health England for those key workers that are desperate to work?
The answer, there's 2 answers. One is that we're standing up a key worker testing capability, and the second is that we are developing a home testing so that people who have been sick can be tested for the presence of antibodies, so that if they're positive, they can then go out and go back to work. And so the home testing programme, which we haven't really talked about so far, is exactly for that reason. People have a test to see whether they've had the condition and developed antibodies, which allow them to leave their home.
Perhaps you might just expand on that and say something about the timing of the availability of the home testing solution.
Yes, I can do that.
Thank you.
So the tests, a small number of tests have arrived for evaluation, and these are in Oxford at the moment, and they will be evaluated rapidly. Several million tests have been purchased for use. So we need to evaluate them in the laboratory to be clear that, because these are brand new products, and be clear that they do work as they are claimed to do so. And once they have been tested, and that will happen this week, then once the bulk of the tests arrive, then they will be distributed into the community, in which there'll be a mechanism to order a test via Amazon, and then performed at home, and then sent back to see whether they're positive or negative. There's 2 different models. It might require you to go to some black booth because it requires a blood thing. So you can see if you have antibodies, in which case you know that you've had the infection. And this is not just for key workers, it's for the general population. And over time, we're expecting that a proportion of the population will be positive, and that would allow them to get back to work.
Yeah. Well, that's very encouraging. You say that several million have been ordered for that, and they're waiting to be tested to be released into the public. Is that the case?
Yes. So 3.5 million have been ordered. That's the amount that we have, and a further millions are being ordered today. But we do need to make sure that we understand how they operate, because these are brand new tests. They haven't been used by us before. And so they are going to be tested in Oxford. And once we are assured that they do work, they will be rolled out into the community. We were rolling out a programme alongside that to check that they work in the field, in people's homes. So PHE have a study so that they will recruit people to have a second blood test, and that will get checked with a gold standard test to make sure that they are working truly as we expect.
And just give us a feeling of when you might expect the testing of the test, as it were, to have completed, so that it can begin to be sent out by Amazon.
Yeah, this testing the test is a small matter, and I would anticipate that it would be done by the end of this week.
So by the beginning of next week, members of the public should be able to order their home tests and be able to test themselves.
Yeah, I think that I would be somewhat less categorical about the date, but in the near future people will be able to order a test that they can test themselves, or go to Boots or somewhere similar to have their finger prick test done.
Well, that is will be extremely welcome to many people across the country, and so if not certainly the beginning of next week, you're talking about a small number of days rather than weeks or months.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
And just to understand a bit more about the nature of this test, so it's a blood test, is it? You sort of prick your finger,
yes.
and then it's got something that you read off as to whether it's
yes.
positive or negative. Is that right?
That's right. It looks like a pregnancy test.
Right.
Except that you're putting a spot of blood on there. So you would have a lancet, or that could be done by someone else or at home. You prick your finger like a diabetic would, and get a drop of blood and put it on a filter paper, and then run some liquid to make that blood run into the test zone. And then you'll read it to look to see if you have two types of antibody. One is IgM, which arises very early during infection, and the other is IgG. So this is the body reacting to the virus. And you would read the lines, or a healthcare worker would read the lines for you to see whether the lines are positive or negative.
And you say a healthcare worker. Does it require a healthcare worker, or can you read it yourself?
No. I mean, you could read it yourself, but some of the sticks, there's a different variety of sticks. Some you can actually just read by eye, and others need to go plugged into a machine just to read it through the instrument reader. And so these details are being rapidly resolved at the moment.
I see. And will it be charged for, or will it be free of charge?
I can't comment on that, but I would have thought that there would be an absolutely minimal charge if there was a charge. This certainly isn't going to be charging the public a large amount of money. So it would be a minimal cost if any cost.
Because it's obviously very strongly in the public interest that as many people are tested and can
absolutely.
Either isolate themselves or be confident that they can go out without infecting others.
Absolutely, and cost should not be a barrier to people having availability of these tests.
Well, thank you for imparting that news to us. I'll turn to Aaron Bell.
Yeah, thank you. A couple of further questions on this development. You said 3.5 million, then some more millions thereafter, but you also implied that, that people will be able to order it themselves at home. Should there not be some element of prioritisation going on here, or are we confident that we will hit the scale required quickly enough?
Well, I think that there would need to be an element of prioritisation. So that we're thinking about how to prioritise that, and also thinking about how to use the test very wisely in some people. So, for example, not all tests are never absolutely perfect in their results. So we're being very thoughtful about how we would use this in the highly vulnerable group. So if somebody in the highly vulnerable group is positive, you would actually go and take a blood draw from them to double check that.
Yep.
Because if the test is false positive and they went out and got the infection, that would be very serious. So we are taking great care. So in terms of populations, we're being extremely careful with that group. But we will need to roll them out in a way that we can actually do the study alongside it. So we'll need to go into people's homes and get another blood draw to make sure that the test is working. So I think that it's likely that we at least in the first few days, regional in the first instance, but we hope to be able to make this available to the general population.
And the second question then, I suppose, is about record keeping, and presumably this will end up on people's medical records. What is the mechanism for people to then go out in the world and say, I have got these antibodies in me, therefore I can't pass things on, and the risk of people doing that fraudulently, bluntly?
Yeah. This will need to link to the GP record, and there's work in train to make sure that happens. So I agree that we need a record, because this is kind of exceptional times. We wouldn't usually ask people to test themselves at home and then act on the basis of that test. It's quite a unique position. So there are plans to make sure that that result goes back to GP. And if these tests are being done in a chemist or a point such as that, then the test could be will be read by an individual in a chemist, and the result will be then recorded in the GP records through electronic mechanism.
Thank you. Chris?
My only slight concern is if we're encouraging people to go out to Boots en masse after ordering this test, are we actually not running the risk that some of these people who haven't developed the antibodies are actually exposing themselves?
That is true, actually. And when I say Boots, I think that I would say like Boots rather than Boots, because these details are being rapidly established at the moment.
Other providers.
I assume that guidance could be given that anyone feeling symptoms can send someone else out to collect it on their behalf.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that the accuracy of blood pricks may be lower than this being done by somebody with some training to do blood pricks. But it's not right that we send people out with symptoms or who haven't had the infection out into a crowded place. We're going to have to come up with a mechanism whereby it could be that we could actually have, if they need to go to one place, they could be one person at a time. They could be sent an appointment by text or something like that. So it's key that we don't have lots of people clustering to have their tests done and read. It's really key.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. Professor Peacock, we're very grateful for your evidence. I'd be interested just to understand how the two testing programs that you've described are going to interact with one another, because on the one hand you've got a program to expand the laboratory testing at a rate that is increasing significantly, but actually is done in a different way from other countries, and that gave me some concern. But on the other hand, you're going to have mass testing available to members of the public within a few days, delivered to the home by Amazon or to be collected from pharmacies. Will these be done in parallel, and are there reasons why you'd want to have two tracks for testing?
Yeah, they are being done in parallel. In fact, the government plan is a 4-point plan. So the first point is 25,000 tests to NHS patients who are sick. The second plan is upscaling testing for key workers with an aim of 100,000 tests or more per day. The third is home-based testing or community-based testing, which can't be done with an antigen test at the moment, so that's why we're going for the antibody test. And so that's going to be a much wider population. And then the final plank is actually looking for the presence of infection in the population, so seroprevalence. That's important because some people might have infection with very few symptoms. So we are doing those in parallel, and they have different target populations for each of those. So there are 4 parallel work streams that are working together to ensure that we are watching, for example, things like reagents and consumables and so on, so that there's no internal competition.
Thank you. And finally, from me, are there any other countries that are doing what you just described to us, this mass home testing by mail?
Yes.
Which countries?
Yes.
Which ones are already doing that?
Well, the tests are being ordered across Europe and elsewhere, and are being purchased in Southeast Asia. So this is a widespread practice. We are not alone in doing this.
They're being ordered by governments, but are they deployed in the populations yet, or are we in the vanguard?